Good morning, everybody. It's great to see all of your faces, and happy to see that everybody seems to be doing well and staying safe and healthy. We're going to go ahead and get started, but just before we start, there are also a lot of people from our team who are not on video right now, but I just really want to do a shout out and thanks to all of our great team on the investment staff and the executive staff for having the technology in place to allow CalSTRS to keep running the way that it has, to our investment team for being so experienced and calm and having such a steady hand in how they're guiding us through some of the uncertainty that we're all experiencing and facing. So thank you very much. So Rosalind, I'll turn it over to you to do the roll.
Okay. So Ms. Bradford, Ms. Hendricks.
Here.
Here. Good morning.
Mr. Pursuant.
Here.
Ms. Yamamoto.
Here.
Ms. Miller for the Director of Finance.
Here.
State Treasurer, Ms. Ma.
Here. Here.
Mr. Yamamaka for the Superintendent of Public Instruction.
Here.
And Controller Yi.
Here.
Okay. So Madam Chairperson, you have a quorum.
Mr. Keeley
Wonderful.
just joined the meeting.
Okay, great. So I will mark Mr. Keeley. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosalind.
Great, thanks, Rosalind, and thank you, Harry. Good to hear your voice. The first item that we have is approval our committee agenda, and I would just ask that we approve it with some flexibility because we are moving one of the agenda items, number 12, to a little bit later in the day to just accommodate our speaker and work with our schedule. So if I could have a motion and a second for the agenda.
Move approval.
I think Sharon made the motion and Gail, I think, seconded. Great, thank you. So I think that's all those in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed?
Aye.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, what we're doing now is we're going to agenda item number 2, which is the opportunity for statements from the public. This item, I just wanted to make clear that this area for public comment is scheduled for 6 minutes. So we will be going until about 9:13. We're going to split the time between callers. Comments made at this time may pertain to topics that aren't covered by a specific agenda item. And I just also want to let the public know that in addition to taking public comment during our meetings, we also take public comment in writing. Since our past meeting leading into this one, we have received public comment from a number of different organizations. There have been some form letters that we've received from different organizations and campaigns, some from Fossil Free California calling for divestment from fossil fuels, some other form letters coming from In Defense of Animals calling for divestment from SeaWorld, and some letters from Code Pink calling for divestment from General Dynamics. We've also heard about other topics of interest from members of the public, including an interest in China. We receive occasional inquiries about our investments in China and Chinese-owned companies, and then continue to also, have inquiries and interest by Fossil Free California. Some other form letters coming from In Defense of Animals calling for divestment from SeaWorld, and some letters from Code Pink calling for divestment. Okay. We're all, I think, still working with the technology here, so apologize for that, that brief interruption. But I think what I'm doing now is turning it over to Danielle and Gur, who are going to help us manage the queue of speakers who are offering public comment.
Okay. We have 12 callers in the queue right now. Our first caller is Jesus. Jesus, go ahead. Jesus?
Could you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Could you hear me? Okay, sorry. Hello there and good morning. My name is Jesus. I'm glad to be with you all, as before the pandemic, I would have had to travel a long way to Sacramento, and that could have been difficult for many reasons. But today we have the privilege of meeting at a distance, and I'll share some information about my beautiful part of the state. It was originally seized from Tongva peoples and given as a land grant to a man named Don Lugo by the Spanish Empire, and it was the home of Glenn T. Seaborg, who discovered the element seaborgium, clearly a product of our schools and ingenuity. In fact, we were the site of a General Motors plant, which produced cars of the future, like Cadillac, right? Actually, we hosted many factories and industries in our prime, and it was sure that the investing of it would give us a future as inhabitants. And when those industries left or exploited us, we realized that it was all a lie. The General Motors plant closed and was replaced by a high school a few years later. And that's where my school is now. Today, less than 3.5% of our population is white, and I myself am an indigenous person from Mexico. We host more than 20 public schools ranging from pre-K to high school and more than 30,000 kids to fill them. We also have an oil well and a gas well. I myself went to school next to an industrial park, and 8% of the children here have asthma, including myself. Every 5 out of 1,000 infants die in their first year of birth, and my cousin's baby was one of them. When I found out that CalSTRS existed and that they were there to ensure the future of our teachers post-retirement, I was thrilled. My teachers are very near and dear to my heart, and they've taught me many life lessons. I stand with my teachers full stop. I stood with them 2 Januaries ago when they went on strike. I stood with my teachers during distance learning in the spring, and I know they stand with me today when I say that it's absolutely disturbing to know that their pension will be weaponized against the very communities they serve. You quote when I first opened your page, "How will you spend your future?" But the real question is, how could you spend your students' millions of futures? How could you condemn thousands, if not millions, of students across the state to a miserable, polluted, and charred future? What do you gain from investing in the violence that is perpetuated against Black and brown students across the state? You say that you stand against racial violence, but then go ahead and keep sponsoring it? A teacher's pension should not come from blood money. Do you really think that you'll most engage the industry by keeping invested? Do you really think that your consultants come from the same things that I do? Are they poor and Black or indigenous? And if not, are you willing to check your assumptions about divestment not being the answer we need right now? That's why we need to keep telling you, divest, 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 because if not, you are perpetuating the same violence that police officers commit when they shoot our backs or kneel on our necks. Listen to us. Now we ask you, will you spend our futures or will you divest? Thank you.
Thank you for your call. Our next caller is Anastasia. Anastasia, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Can I?
Go ahead. Anastasia, we can hear you.
My name is Anastasia. Okay, thank you. My name is Anastasia, and I just graduated from Santa Monica High School, where Harry Keeley is supposedly employed. I called in today to question the efficacy of your engagement and strategy with fossil fuel corporations. This board has been referring to this strategy for so many years, and yet not once have any successful results of the strategy been made public or shared with the CalSTRS teachers. What effects have you really produced with this engagement? You have had people of all ages voicing opposition to this strategy at nearly every meeting. Yet, if you are as confident as you say you are about how well the strategy is working, why not just reveal the results and let us compare them to the positive results that would be achieved if the $6 billion was invested directly into sustainable funds? This lack of transparency with the public and the teachers whose paychecks you are investing is the problem. The 1 million teachers are simply supposed to trust that their money isn't going into perpetuating the fossil fuel economy, poisoning our resources, and disproportionately injuring communities of color. I urge you to divest the $6 billion from fossil fuels. Thank you.
Okay, our next caller is Amian. Go ahead.
Hello?
Go ahead, we can hear you.
Hello? Okay. Hello, my name is Amin. I'm with the Earth Guardians Bay Area crew. Of course, you know that we, the youth and teachers, are very frustrated, disappointed, and tired that we have to keep pointing out that engagement is not the strategy being called out for by indigenous communities, climate scientists, and families who live next to oil extractions. Are you already aware that in California, 92% of the people living to fossil fuel sites are Black, Indigenous, or people of color? You say that over and over that you care about climate change. Will you then dedicate at least a section of your next agenda to hear a presentation about frontline solutions and answer questions from teachers and students we know who live in areas very different than most of you and your staff probably live? Will you make space to check your assumptions about engagement strategy with people who you aren't already in conversation with? I was with a meeting with you, Mr. Kelly and Ms. Hendricks, along with the CEO and 20 other students this year. We chatted a little afterwards, and you both told me that you appreciate my public speaking skills. I think you left with a good feeling about our connection, and might have thought that I did too. As a young Black man, it was really uncomfortable when in the middle of the meeting, you asked where I am from and did not ask anyone else. When I said Somalia, you shared that part of CalSTRS cannot divest. Why part of CalSTRS cannot divest is because poor people like those in African countries cannot afford renewable energy. This felt really painful and frustrating. As a person from an African country, it hurt me to see how Harry, as a Westerner, presented yourself as a person who knows what's best for the continent, and that you are actually helping us by investing in fossil fuels. In East Africa, we use hydropower to get electricity, and it's been working for years. Most people in my country went from having no telephones directly to cell phones. They skipped landline. We don't want you to continue your engagement and money going into fossil fuels. We need you to stand for bringing subsidies and investments that set us up to scale alternatives. This will have great effect on the lives of millions. Lots of organizations right now are committing to look at how white supremacy culture is alive within them, no matter how progressive they are compared to others. A few weeks ago, I went to get a snack at a shop, and a woman screamed the N-word at me. It's going to take a long time to get rid of the world of racism in every individual. However, in the positions that you have right now, you have the power to make a massive contribution to ending systematic environmental racism with our teachers' money. Are you open to investigating how much of your commitment to engagement strategy and absence of authentic communication with frontline communities might be contaminated by white supremacy culture?
Thank you for your comment. Our next caller is Miriam. Miriam, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Miriam, and I'm a young person who's not so naive to think my words today won't fall on deaf ears. In fact, given that during COVID, this meeting is held virtually, I have no guarantee that you even muted me to save yourself the discomforting cries of young people begging for a future. So instead of reminding you that I struggle to breathe because of my asthma caused by pollution exposure from fossil fuels, I'm going to speak your language. Your own Brian Rice admitted that climate change is your greatest threat, but you did nothing. You knew, but did not divest from Energy Transfer, even when its shares dropped by 18% on July 8th before the DAPL pipeline was shut down for a second time. Did you and your financial analysts not see the warning signs? Still, you didn't divest. Now the construction of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline has been halted. Chesapeake Energy declared bankruptcy, and Exxon's shares are down by 41% from last year. Why are you squandering the pensions of teachers? Because change is difficult? Because you love the fossil fuels which are threatening my future? Your investment decisions are bleeding money because you won't divest. You had one job. You're failing because you want to sit on your asses instead of making the decision to make more money while protecting me, your children, and everyone in my generation.
Thank you for your call. Our next caller is Diana. Diana, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Diana Curiel, and I'm a CalSTRS member. CalSTRS has a fiduciary responsibility to assess its investment risks. Recent activity in climate liability lawsuits is relevant to the ESG risks associated with fossil fuels. According to a recent article in climatedocket.com and a Stanford Law School webinar, climate liability suits filed by nearly 24 municipalities are now proceeding in state, federal, and appellate courts across the country. Plaintiffs are using these lawsuits to shift the burden of climate adaptation costs from taxpayers to polluters. Fossil fuel executives will be faced with evidence that for decades, they knowingly misled the public about the climate threat posed by their products. This will change public opinion regarding the wisdom of investing in these companies and who is liable for damages arising from climate change. The board has an obligation to ensure that the corporations in which CalSTRS invests strive for long-term sustainability in their operations. CalSTRS, the time to divest from fossil fuels is now.
Thank you for your comments. Our next caller is John. John, go ahead. John? Or is it Joan?
Joan, yes.
Sorry, go ahead.
This is Joan Lohman. Yes. Hi, this is Joan Lohman. Good morning. I'm from Oakland. I'm 76. I'm the spouse of a CalSTRS retiree who worked for 30 years as a teacher and administrator at City College of San Francisco. My life benefits from my wife's CalSTRS pension. My parents were lifetime teachers and CalSTRS pensioners. My brother is a lifetime California public school teacher, also a CalSTRS beneficiary. CalSTRS has $30 million invested in energy transfer bonds. As you know, on July 6th, the District of Columbia Court ruled that the Dakota Access Pipeline, designed by Energy Transfer, must be shut down pending a strict environmental review. The value of Energy Transfer stocks have plummeted with the court decision. And where was CalSTRS policy of engagement when the pipeline was allowed to go forward with no environmental review? Where was CalSTRS engagement when thousands of concerned citizens gathered at the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation for months to protest a pipeline that threatened the community's water and sacred burial sites? Where was CalSTRS policy of engagement when over 300 police officers, using tasers, pepper spray, sound cannons, and clubs, descended on the treaty camp at Standing Rock and violently broke up a peaceful protest in 2016? Why did CalSTRS not terminate its relationship to Energy Transfer after these egregious actions? How can CalSTRS claim its policy of engagement is intact when every part of the ESG tool was blatantly ignored in the case of the Energy Transfer? E, environmental. There was no significant environmental review. S, social. Energy Transfer ignored an international outcry over the threat to the water source and burial grounds of the Standing Rock Sioux. G, governance. What was askew in Energy Transfer's governance that would move forward with such a monumental project with no significant environmental report? Energy Transfer is just one example of the questionable ethics and impacts of the fossil fuel industry. I and my partner do not want our pension that sustains our lives to be invested in life-threatening projects. As a member of Fossil Free California and as a beneficiary of CalSTRS pension, I urge you to place divestment on your September agenda. And thank you for your time.
Thank you for your call. Our next caller is Lynn. Lynn, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Lynn Nittler, a CalSTRS member. I'm getting really nervous about the increasingly risky fossil fuel investments in my pension plan. According to a July 2nd, 2020 article published in Inside Climate News, Shell said it would slash the value of its oil and gas assets by $22 billion. 2 weeks earlier, BP said it would reduce the value of its assets by $17 billion. Both companies said the accounting moves were in response not only to coronavirus-driven recession, but also global efforts to tackle climate change. Andrew Logan, Senior Director of Oil and Gas at Ceres, admitted in a huge turnaround, quote, real assets with real dollar figures associated with them are likely to be stranded or left undeveloped in a decarbonizing world. Ceres, a sustainable business advocacy group you know, represents major investors like you. Ceres says, quote, that the risk is real and it's here in the present is a really big deal. Yet U.S. oil companies still insist there's no problem here. Exxon says their oil and gas reserves face little risk of being stranded. Is CalSTRS willing to take them at their word and ignore the evidence otherwise? Whiting Petroleum, Diamond Offshore, and Chesapeake Energy have already declared bankruptcies. With shutdowns from COVID-19 and the imminent closure of the Dakota Access Pipeline, the shale companies may face permanent closures too. Exxon had to write down $2.9 billion this May due to lower oil prices. Some analysts say gas and oil companies are approaching a future of dwindling demand and stranded assets. Why are you risking $6 billion to prop up a dying industry? Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Our next caller is Dave. Dave, go ahead.
Good morning. My name is Dave Keller. I'm a teacher at Piedmont High School in Piedmont, California. Recently, my teachers union, the Association of Piedmont Teachers, passed a resolution supporting the STRS divestment from fossil fuel producing companies. The teachers want divestment because fossil fuel companies are advancing climate change much faster than scientists predicted. We have reached 417 parts per million CO2 already and are on track to reach 440 parts per million by 2030. That means in just 9 years, we'll be over the Paris Accord limit. This is already having a devastating impact on our climate, but you know that. And so I'm wondering, what is it that STRS is doing to address this situation? According to investment belief number 9, investment risks associated with climate change materially impact the value of CalSTRS investment portfolio. Is CalSTRS taking action? Please divest now. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your comment. Our next caller is Jolene. Jolene, go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Jolene Siebert. I am speaking simply as a retired third grade teacher from Reedley, California. I have been watching the global warming issue since I heard about a scientist measuring carbon dioxide levels on a mountain in Hawaii. I think his name is Hansen. I understand the atmosphere. More CO2 traps heat and warms us, which seems like a bad idea. Burning fossil fuels gives off CO2. Fossil fuels are killing the planet. Fossil fuels are killing people. Therefore, fossil fuels are a bad investment. Divest CalSTRS from fossil fuels. Teachers should not be invested in a product that kills people and the planet. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Our next caller is Dorothy. Dorothy, go ahead. Dorothy, go ahead.
Hello?
We can hear
Okay,
you.
good. Okay, first, yes. Okay, my name's Dorothy Schumacher Jennings. I'm a retired teacher. You know, it's really important. I really appreciate having a pension. It allows me to feel like I'm, you know, have a certain sense of stability in this unprecedentedly difficult time. It's been incredible, and I appreciate your attempts, your stewardship of the funds, basically. But it's so important. It's incredibly important that CalSTRS follow the lead of the UC system in divestment from fossil fuels. It can be done in an orderly fashion, but it must begin immediately. Not only is it morally unconscionable to keep investing in elements that are undisputably damaging our planet, perpetuating environmental racism and destroying the futures of our young people, but this time of coronavirus provides the perfect opportunity to do so. These investments are no longer fiscally sound. The world's taken a long pause, and many people have realized that perpetuating reliance on fossil fuels is quickly becoming archaic. CalSTRS must invest in the future, in renewable energy, to give our students the certitude that we have their best interests at heart, and also to keep teachers, retired teachers and teachers solvent. Begin divesting now, or CalSTRS will be left shamefully behind. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you for your comment. Our next caller is Park. Park, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Park Guthrie. I'm a sixth grade teacher and longtime CalSTRS member. I live in Sonoma County. Thank you for your service. I do not envy you the weight you must all feel stewarding the retirement funds of California teachers. I believe your fiduciary duty requires you to divest from fossil fuels. It's becoming more and more clear that engagement and active stewardship are not sufficient to drive paradigm shifts that support healthy long-term investment and growth. It's becoming abundantly clear that the fossil fuel industry both opposes important regulations to speed the transition to low carbon future. And one example of that is carbon pricing. Even sort of the poster child of fossil fuel companies that quote unquote supports carbon pricing, BP, invested $13 million in defeating a carbon pricing measure. And I looked at the top 20 recipients of oil and gas donations in Congress, and none of them support a bipartisan carbon pricing bill on the floor right now. And all of them voted for an anti-carbon pricing bill. So the fossil fuel industry does not support the measures that CalSTRS itself says are necessary. And it's clear they also support measures that support systemic racism. So in the words of Mr. Ailman in his March 5th letter, he said, entrenched interests remain strong and resistance to change is fierce. Meaningful, decision-useful ESG disclosures and analysis remains the exception rather than the rule. In many regions, regulations that reflect a more long-term investment paradigm have been slow to evolve. Paradigms do not evolve. They shift rapidly and precipitously. We've all just witnessed a paradigm shift happening in our country about the roots of white supremacy and the prevalence of white supremacy. The fossil fuel industry is exposed to liability based on its historic and ongoing support of policies which maintain environmental racism. So,
30 seconds.
So I believe your fiduciary duty requires you to examine divestment closely and follow the lead of UC Berkeley and divest from fossil fuels. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comment. Our last caller is Linda. Linda, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Linda Bassett. I was a teacher for 25 years and just retired and enjoying my retirement at this moment. Thank you very much. I was a teacher in Wilmington, California, where there are 5 refineries within about a 10-mile radius. And I've been fighting for our environment and for our children for at least 10 years now. And I'm appalled at the effects that it's having on our children in these frontline communities, first of all. Second of all, Second of all, I want to read to you something that was on CNBC on January 31st, 2020 at 10:07 a.m. Eastern Time. Jim Cramer, the host of CNBC's Mad Money, co-founder of The Street and former stockholder and hedge fund manager, declared fossil fuels dead after oil giants ExxonMobil and Chevron reported Q4 earnings this morning. When asked about Exxon's and Chevron stocks, which are dragging down the Dow today on Squawk Box, Cramer gave a damning prognosis to a surprised Rebecca Quick. And he said, I'm done with fossil fuels. They're done. They're just done. We're starting to see divestment all over the world. We're starting to see companies just regard them as, big pension funds saying, listen, we're not going to own them anymore. It doesn't matter how good they are. The world's changed. There's new managers. They don't want to hear whether these are good or bad. And he goes on and on. The issue is the sustainability, he said. This is the other side of Tesla. These stocks don't want to be owned by younger people. I'm asking the board, how long are you going to wait before you divest? The other day, at the beginning of March and the beginning of this pandemic, the price of a barrel of oil was $. The oil companies were paying people to buy their oil. Did you panic then? What was going through your mind? What are you going to do? You know the writing's on the wall. I ask you how you will feel when this whole market drops and we are left with $6 billion invested in this. Please act now. Please divest now. Lead, save the planet, and save our pensions
30
too,
seconds.
and feel good. Thank you. That's all I have to say, and thank you very much.
Thank you for your comment. This concludes the item 2 public comments.
Thank you very much, Danielle. Thank you very much for those of you who called into our meeting today, as well as those who submitted written comments. I just want to make sure that everybody knows that all of those comments, whether in writing or verbally, are provided to all of the members of the investment committee, as well as our leadership, and we greatly appreciate your time and your engagement. So I'd like now to move on to the next parts of the agenda. We have agenda items 3 through 7, which are consent action items. I just wanted to note that for agenda items 3 and 4, which are approval of our meeting minutes from March and May, Karen helped us identify a couple of typos in those minutes, and so those typos will be fixed as part of the adoption of the minutes. Are there any items that anybody needs to pull from the consent agenda? Then I think I'd take a motion to approve the consent agenda.
So moved. Second.
Okay, thank you. I think that was Bill with the motion and Harry with the second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Okay. Any opposed or abstentions? Okay, so we've approved items 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So now moving on to, we have 2 agenda items 8 and 9, which are consent agenda items, information only. Does anybody have any questions or items they'd like to raise with these 2 agenda items? Okay, thank you. Then we'll move on to agenda item number 10, which is a review of our fiscal year 2020 to 21 business plans. Yes.
I'm so sorry. No, I forgot on the, we're fine. Have the private equity consultant contract extension is totally fine with us. We did sort of, I don't know that because we're kind of in this virtual meetings for a long time now, I just want to be really cognizant that we don't substitute virtual meetings for due diligence in any way. So I don't want to think that, I just want to make sure that we are really cognizant of contract extensions in the future. So I would just like to make sure that we're not necessarily going to continue on this path as a reason, and that we'll sort of, if in fact, when our private equity contract comes up again, that we do the due diligence. I understand sort of we're still getting used to this, as we all are, but I do think it's a new normal, and I just want to be cognizant that we never sort of see that kind of verbiage again around any type of contract extension, and we're mindful that we continue our same processes as we go on. I'm sorry, I meant to say that before the item came up. Again, we're totally supportive of it.
Thank you, Gail. No problem, and I really appreciate your comments. I think what I'd add is that in the brief conversation that Harry and I had with Chris about taking this approach, that was, before I think our board chair and vice chair, Harry and Sharon, made the decision that given what's happening in the environment, we would have to hold our meetings virtually through the end of the year. so I think now that we know that that's sort of what we anticipate for the foreseeable future, I think we'll definitely take that into account in terms of how we handle this particular contract as well as other contracts that might be coming up with the investment committee. But I totally hear you. We can't. We've got to figure out how to manage some of these things in a new environment. So thank you, Gail. Okay, then I think going back to item number 10, it's our fiscal year 2020-21 business plans. Just for everybody's reminder, we do have this item scheduled for 20 minutes, so we'll go until about 9:35. So Chris, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Joy. Good morning, everybody. The business plans are really actually a very critical element. They're fairly unique to CalSTRS, or one of the few pension plans that takes the time to stop and write business plans. But think of the fact that you've already got, over 60 participants on this call alone. You've got a staff of over 150 investment officers and then a cadre of over 200 money managers. Keeping everybody on the same step and heading the same direction is absolutely essential. And I really am sincere when I said in this, I think it's the secret sauce to our success is that we think like a money manager compared to many of our peers. If you have any questions about any of the asset class business plans, the staff is on the sidebar ready to jump in and answer questions about those. I'm not going to get into the extreme details on the 10-year business plan. We've used this tool, as you can see, for over 20 years. There are two drivers to the investment portfolio and to our cost structure. One is assets under management, AUM. So that's why we take the time to forecast the range we think that may come. Then the other is the complexity of the portfolio, which is a lot harder to measure. But what we can do is we can look at the Canadians, we can look at some of the sovereign wealth funds, and funds that get larger, especially as they approach $300, $400 billion, get immensely more complex. I often tell the staff, sadly, but it looks like broccoli or cauliflower. It starts basic, but then blossoms. So a key for us is obviously managing costs. You've seen the news reports. Other plans are doing other things to try and keep earning 7%. I actually think Institutional Investor did a good job of writing up an analysis that our master plan, as they called it, is to reduce costs. As you have said, and we have said many times, if we can take the same investments and reduce the cost by 20 or 50 basis points, that's 0.2 to 0.5% of added return in our pocket without taking more risk. So I would turn your attention to INV 98. It's a sixth page of the investment business plan. On my tablet, it doesn't have the page number. So it's the graph right after the busy 10-year financial plan. And these two charts are intended to be the same legend. I apologize that I used slightly different words.
Sorry to jump in, Chris. The INV page number again. I'm sorry, Madam Chair. Chris, the page number again?
98.
Thank you.
So page 6 of the financial plan. There are three drivers of costs for us. The first is the blue area, which we call the support budget. Now that's actually the one budget that you see and goes to the Department of Finance. So all eyes are actually on that blue line, even though it's very, very small. That's the cost of the investment staff, all of our tools, our services, travel, issues like that. The green box, which is more expensive, but you do see that comes out in the financial report each year. That's our continuously appropriated. So finance and the legislature don't really monitor it very closely because it's just continuously appropriated to whatever it is. Those are our service contracts to most of our global equity, fixed income, our traditional asset managers, where we have a traditional state contract, even some of our real estate managers. That's a much larger figure. Obviously, as you can see, multiples of the blue line, but that is captured in the financial statements. The biggest source of cost which you had highlighted a couple of years ago, shout out to Paul Rosensteel, who really made it a big issue, was the carried interest and the performance fees that we pay. Now, those are netted out of the returns we get, similar to mutual funds you might be in, where the cost of that mutual fund is netted. So it's not expressed as a fee. It's not broken out or paid out. But now that we're using the cost report, we're capturing that on a regular basis. So these charts are really from the top down at the big picture, using that cost report of what it costs to run each asset class. Now, we only have 4 years of the cost report, but we think that at least I'm using that as a guide. What I'd like to do in the future is actually build these charts from the bottom up at the asset class level. The challenge is you're trying to assume what kind of performance fees and carried interest we're going to pay in the future. But the bottom line is the chart at the top is business as usual. If we only have about 5 to 6% of the private equity portfolio in co-investments, if we keep real estate where it is, where we only have about 3 or 4 real estate operating companies and the rest is out in manager contracts, and infrastructure, where we're mostly paying fees to managers to run those assets, you can see our costs just continue to rise on a steady track, going over and approaching $2 billion a year out there in 10 years from now. So to borrow a phrase from the pandemic, and sorry to use that as an analogy, but it's just so apropos, our goal is to bend the curve, is to take that cost curve and arc it and break it down. Now you can see in the lower box with the collaborative model, the blue line actually grows a little bit more because as we have said, you've got to spend money and to your credit, you're spending it now. You had approved a 5-year business plan, which we used up within 3 years. We're going to be coming back to finance and to you this fall with a new 5-year business plan that will assume that we're implementing the collaborative model, and it's incumbent on the staff to show you that cost savings and to show you that cost benefit. What the blue line actually does grow a little bit faster. The green line, we think we can get economies of scale, and we can break that down a little bit by moving a few more assets internal in the public side. But the real cost savings, and it's almost an 8-to-1 to 10-to-1 cost ratio, is in the pink area. That's where we think by owning asset managers, as we do in real estate, doing a lot more in co-investments and in better fee structures in private equity, and then being more creative and moving away from separate accounts to owning asset managers in infrastructure. That's where through the collaborative model, we think we can really bend the cost curve. And the power of that is that the cost curve is 2% and 20 basis points or 20% of the profits. If you can cut that back as we have been, our average now is about 1 3/4 and about 18% of the profits. But if we can get that even farther down, and as I've mentioned before in real estate, Mike has given you live examples of companies where we own the company, they then get hired by other public pension plans. We capture that as revenue. So we go from a fee to a flat to actually a revenue standpoint. And that's where out there in year 5, 6, 7, 8, that cost curve really starts to break because we start to see revenue. Now it's incumbent on us to capture those net numbers. They're hard to distill out. You don't know them until after the fact. But we think that is a really key component in our ability to earn 7%. It all comes back to our ability to earn 7%. So I just really wanted to highlight that. It's the oddity of the way we're structured, that the smallest cost figure is the one that everybody has the most visibility on and finance has oversight of. The green line is there and by law and just is part of the budget, but it's that other cost figure that we are now capturing, that we are really trying to bend and lower. Are there any questions or comments about that?
Let's see, Chris, I'm sorry. We do have a couple of questions. Let's see, so we'll go to Bill. Bill Prezant.
Thank you very much, Joy. This was a great presentation. My compliments to the entire team at the investment area. And what I'd like to ask you, Chris, is I recall reading a while back that there was a study done for 2018 that showed the amount of funds that the amount of costs that were incurred on internal management versus external management. Is there anything being done to show that for 2019?
We will do that. That'll be part of the November cost report that Deborah Smith's team, led by Shafat in April, will deliver to you. And it will break out internal, external. The ratio, Bill, is roughly 10 to 1. That it costs us about 1/10 the cost to hire our own staff versus hiring Wall Street. And what we're seeing is that might be a bit aggressive. It might be closer to 8 to 1, but that's still a huge multiplier.
Well, I just want to make one observation that, given the challenges that we're going to face at the state level and at the local government level in terms of funding the pension fund, that it really highlights how important this issue is to the success of CalSTRS. If this is where the tire really is going to meet the road, if we can generate more than 60 to 65%, we're going to have to generate more than that to pay these benefits over time, because local governments are going to be really challenged at the local school district level, at the employer level, and the state's going to be challenged. And so to me, this is one of the most critical issues that we have facing us. And to whatever extent that we can as a board push this issue and do whatever we can to assist the investment division in moving the collaborative model in a much more speedy way. I think we really have to do that because the world has changed. This pandemic has changed the way everybody does business. And as we move forward, we're going to see that we're going to have to watch our costs, both at the investment level and at the operational level as well. So anyway, I just want to make that comment. To me, this is one of the most important issues we face. And I really thank you and your team for having done a terrific job of moving the collaborative model along with the Pillars Project and all the other things that you've been doing. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thanks very much, Bill. And I heartily concur with the comments that you made. We have two more speakers. We'll go to Harry and then to Gail. Harry?
Thanks, Madam Chair. I don't have a question, Chris. I just wanted to be on the record to let you and the staff know that you have my full support around your two slides there. The one is the bending the cost curve. And I know those are estimates. It's tough to predict what's going to happen tomorrow, let alone, literally, it's tough to predict what's going to happen tomorrow, let alone what's going to happen in years out. But these forecasts and projections are in the hundreds of millions of dollars in cost savings to the system that will come back and will be invested back into the fund that will grow on a compounded basis to pay benefits. Whatever we can do to do that, you have my full support. And I think it's critically important that we as a board understand what we have control over. And this could very well be one of them. And I love the moving from a fee to flat to revenue model. That's transformative. If we can execute that, that is truly transformative in, I believe, the public pension world in the United States. So as a board member, I need to understand how we can support these efforts. It's going to be multi-year. And obviously, it's going to take bodies and it's going to take people. And there's a cost associated with that. And there's other organizations and institutions that we have to look to and speak to and convince that we as an investment branch are going to need to grow in order to achieve these cost savings. So I think there's a compelling argument to move this forward. And I just wanted to let you and the team know you have my full support.
Great. Thank you very much, Harry. Gail, we'll go to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Chris, for the presentation. I do think it's great, and obviously we support it as well, and always pass your kudos on to Paul. Just a few more specific questions around implementation. On INV 99, I think the detailed plan is really great. I wonder if it's a little bit aspirational. So I'm just wondering sort of the impediments to growing the size and the skill set, and what the dual path of management and training will look like in order to reach the goals, or what you see as the biggest impediments or risks to implementing it.
Thanks, Gail. It is aspirational. The absolute biggest impediment is the people. I've often told you, of the $250 billion we have, to me, the most important asset is the 170 investment officers that used to walk in and out of that building, but now we're all at home. And the key is going to be to hiring that talent and building it. And I am afraid and sad to say, but that talent does not reside in Sacramento. We're trying to pull people in, but even then you do get people reluctant to come to Sacramento. We're going to have to use this new, as Bill said, this new world of remote access to allow people to be in the Bay Area, in LA, and likely work in different areas. And the key is talent. You've got two forces challenging us. One is succession plan, because you have a lot of your experienced people, as we've outlined, due to retire. So passing that knowledge on, and then building that new team. And the other challenge is really culture. As you know, I think we have a very unique and special culture in the investment branch. But frankly, I don't know how to do culture when everybody is remote and actually being in their own homes. So that's something we're going to have to learn as we grow into this world, just like every other company. But I think that's the area you can constantly grill us, is how are we doing on that recruitment? Are we bringing in the talent? I've really tasked Scott to work with Margot on certainly building out that co-investment team within the private equity unit. That is critical for us. And then obviously Mike knows that succession planning within real estate. Those are the two areas that are important to the collaborative model, and the two areas where we have succession planning and talent as the key. So we will be communicating with the compensation committee pretty regularly to give you real online, on-time facts about how our recruitments are going, because that does lean over into that uncomfortable area of total compensation. And are we able to compete in that environment and find those people? And it gets back to business structure. Bill's comment, we have the 4-pillar project to try and help us operate a bit more efficiently. That is what we said is critical to be able to implement this model. But we may find as we go farther that it's even more challenging in our governmental model. And we know that from the Canadians as they've moved forward. We see the advantages of their model, but then also the disadvantages. And those are things I think out in year 5, we're going to have frank discussions about, can we do this well within the government structure, or do we need to look at other structures for some of our companies? But we're already seeing the benefits of basically having real estate operating companies that are almost an extension of our own team. We can use them for research. We can use them for information. They're out operating as an independent company, which we have minority or sometimes majority control of, and can work effectively with them.
I appreciate that. I have 2 follow-ups, Madam Chair, if that's okay.
Sorry, go ahead, Gail.
Okay, thank you. One, we talk a lot about real estate, and I have a specific question on real estate and private equity and the collaborative model. In terms of global equity, INV 102, I think that's the piece where we really should start, in addition to the partnerships that we see in real estate and hopefully we'll begin to see in private equity. What's kind of an example of how global equity is actually expanding internal asset management, or any of these? It's hard to see just from the business plan how they're actually being implemented, and maybe just some specific examples of how they've changed. And global equity seems to be, since we're going so much in-house, like how June's team has been able to effectively execute that.
I will let June speak for herself.
Good morning, board members. We set off on a multi-year project actually to build out our internal management capabilities. When I first got here, it was North America, US, and Canada. And so the first chunk of internal management was non-US developed markets, EFA strategies. And so we have a considerable sized internal portfolio, which provides us with fee savings. And the next phase of the internal management effort is emerging markets, which is the most expensive market segment for us right now in terms of the fees that we pay. And so our estimate, if we're to bring in a piece of that passively and be able to manage it internally in an index portfolio, is very considerable. It could be 30 to 40 basis points of fee savings. And so you multiply that by the asset base and it's in the millions of dollars. Over just the past 2 fiscal years, we've also increased the number of US and non-US strategies. Approximately, our estimate is close to 10 billion over the past 2 fiscal years that we've brought in internally that were previously managed externally. And every dollar brought internal is incremental fee savings. So our current project for this fiscal year is emerging markets, which will be potentially very beneficial.
Yeah. And maybe I'll add a few comments because I've talked with June about her strategy relative to the long term, because we're talking 10 years now, that their team over this period of time most likely will also have the opportunity and develop the skill sets to manage another emerging part of our portfolio, which would be risk factors or smart beta. And I know that June has that capability, but we'll also be developing that with her team. And so that's another area over the long term where I think we can make a lot of ground.
So Gail, I would add, basically, we're running all the passive assets we can. And now you're going to start seeing us, which we've been doing, is branch off into enhanced index type products. We already have 2 cases where an index is created. We buy the license and they send us the feed. We execute the trades and manage the portfolio instead of relying on an outside manager. So I think you can see us arc on that continuum to eventually, maybe even someday, doing active management internal. That would be a huge reach for where CalSTRS has been way back 20 years ago, but it's definitely, you can see it as a potential skill set in our abilities.
One last thing I'll add is we also funded a low carbon index portfolio that's related to the SISS portfolio, but we didn't have to go outside to hire an investment manager. We were able to start that strategy ourselves against the low carbon index. So it provides flexibility in other areas of the total fund where we may want to express a view. We have those capabilities.
Great. Thank you. I really appreciate that, everyone. My final question is around real estate. And one of the risks, on INV 108 is a lack of increase in technological resources to enhance staff's efficiency. Could you talk a little bit about that and what that is?
I will invite Mike to come in since it's on technology. Hopefully he is online and has the background. Michael?
And then Michael, while you're talking, could you talk about kind of the partnerships with the REITs? That was a risk you had highlighted in the past. If you could give an update on that, please.
Sure. So with respect to technology, I think the real estate industry, it's not a secret, is pretty far behind with
Michael, can I interrupt you real quick? Can you turn on your camera so the public can see you?
Okay.
All right. There we go.
Okay. Good morning. The real estate industry is pretty far behind with respect to having good technologies to manage portfolios and to do attribution analysis of our portfolios. But we're delving into a couple that we're going to take a look at this year is on both portfolio management and attribution analysis. We're in negotiation with one group to purchase their services. We've also already hired someone for fee verification. It was one of the things that came up in one of our audits that you'll see tomorrow, but we've hired a firm to use technology to do our fee verification processing. Data and contact management, we're working, actually private equity took the lead to bring in a group for data and contact management. So we're going down the path that group should be hired in January this year. So we're applying a lot of different technologies. And I would think by this time next year, at least 3 different companies will be working with in depth to manage our portfolio contacts and also help us with analysis of our fees. With respect to working with REITs, we're new in making investments in the REIT area. We found that when we've joint ventured with REITs in the past, it was problematic for us to get alignment of interest, because in most of our relationships, we have majority control. In our joint ventures with REITs, we've had a tough time having those control provisions where we could kind of direct the purchase and sale of assets. So our focus right now in investing in the REIT area, which is not significant this time, I believe we have about 300 million under management, is more to look at the opportunity in REITs to, when there's a dislocation in the public markets, for us to use our analysis of what's happening in the private markets to see if there's an opportunity to buy REITs. And I believe that we're actually looking at it. We actually commissioned a strategy with an independent fiduciary to try to look at options for us to invest in that area.
Great. Thank you. And Madam Chair, this is really my final question for Mike while I have you. I was surprised in the business plan, it didn't sort of point out the inherent risks in post-pandemic, with the work from home posture and how difficult and kind of, commercial real estate being so different, especially given some of the ongoing successes you've had and how close you are to your asset allocation. I just wondering how you're factoring that risk into the business plan. I just didn't see anything about that. I understand the staffing resources as the risk and technology as a risk, but just how, and maybe this is not a fair question to put on you because it's the economy writ large, but just how you see specifically the work from home posture and real estate playing into your
certainly as we'd like to see everyone get back out there as soon as it's safe, because we want people to go visit our real estate. I mean, obviously we have a vested interest in people getting out and using offices, going shopping. There are some aspects of our portfolio that are doing actually better because of this. The industrial portfolio is thriving as more and more shipping is being done directly to homes, and so more and more need for industrial space. But it's clear already that retail is going to get hit the hardest. How hard it's going to get hit really depends on how long this lasts and whether consumers change their shopping preferences of the way they buy. I think office is next in line, that there's a huge question out there of when people are going to go back and utilize offices, and when they do, how are they going to? Obviously, we're going through that thought process at CalSTRS ourselves with the use of our office space. So those are the ones that we're focusing on the most. Residential, quite frankly, isn't seeing much of a hit. We did see some valuation changes in our portfolio, but demand has stayed strong, although the effects of the economy should hurt demand for higher end residential space going forward if we dip into a deeper recession. So the only other aspect that we're concerned about is the speed of transactions and how we go about making decisions on real estate assets when we're used to going out and kicking the tires, if you will, or kicking the bricks, as we say, and seeing the assets directly. So how decisions are going to be made going forward is going to be a challenge, but it's a challenge for the whole industry, so we don't think we're at a disadvantage at this point.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Gail. Okay, we have Betty, the controller, up next, and then I don't have any other board members in the queue. So I just wanted to remind everyone that after Betty, this is an action item, so we'll need to vote on this. So Betty, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Joy. Can you hear me? Thank you, Joy, very much. And I apologize, I had my audio crash just a little while ago. So appreciated Gail's questions about real estate and whether the pandemic has actually had impact with respect to slowing down the collaborative model implementation, but maybe just too soon to tell. I wanted to focus some attention just a little bit on the SISS portfolio, because There's been a lot of attention paid, and probably more so ongoing, on the role of human capital management. And obviously, with so many displaced from the economy, from the pandemic-induced recession, I know that part of the work plan for the SISS work plan was to really do some engagement on executive compensation, but I guess I would say probably even more a broader focus on human capital management as we go forward, with how many workers have been displaced from so many industries, and looking at whether instead of just relying on our partnerships with respect to that particular area, whether we could take a little bit more of a leadership role. Just seems to me that this is going to drive a lot of just the timing of when the economy recovers, the types of opportunities that are going to be available with respect to jobs going forward, that could also inform our investment decisions. So just really kind of and I just want to put that forth in terms of whether that can be elevated as an area of focus.
I'll ask Kirsty to come on and talk about that. That's part of the work plan that we adopted. Obviously, climate change was the top issue, and it's certainly risen up. So, Kirsty?
Sure, thank you very much, Controller Yee. I guess I would say that in the business plan for SISS, and we'll talk about this in the next agenda item, given that we have different distinct parts of our portfolio, both the investment piece and the stewardship piece, the business plan that you see doesn't fully capture all of the priorities and the focus that we're giving on our stewardship activities, just for the nature of having to squish everything into 2 pages. I would absolutely, say that, as we talked about in January and have been subsequently, our core priorities around the transition to a low carbon economy and board effectiveness, particularly oversight of human capital management and diversity, which are obviously 2 such important issues in where we find ourselves today. We've very much been active in looking at how to exacerbate the activities that we're running there. Been working with multiple groups of both our fellow asset owners around the world, organizations like the Principles for Responsible Investment, Business and Human Rights Resource Center, which is a really excellent sort of NGO focused on the intersection of human rights and business, particularly in a post-COVID response, and others. So I think we're going to be very much setting our agenda for the next year focused on human capital management, specifically in light of what does this mean post the pandemic, and we're not even post it yet, as we know. So very much hear that, and executive compensation as well is also one of these key priorities. We've just got some of the results of our proxy voting activities for the last year, where we've really increased the votes against particular companies that we don't think are paying for performance going forward, and that is going to be something for follow-up, obviously, as we really think about going forward. So I hope that addresses it. I'm sorry that it doesn't capture everything in its full area. We did just publish the value of engagement yesterday, which gives some highlights as well on these activities, where hopefully the board can get a little bit more updates on where we're trying to prioritize these really important issues.
No, thank you, Kirsty, and I appreciate that. And this is not meant to add, just more to your already full plate, but probably just what I'm asking, I think, is just really to keep an eye with respect to any developments relative to that whole area of human capital management. It is going to be top of mind as more people are seeking to get back into the economy, and the behavior of companies in terms of how to accommodate certainly their needs, and hopefully not exacerbating the vulnerabilities that we saw as the pandemic hit, and certainly the recession following that.
Yeah, we hear you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Betty, for raising that issue. I agree. And I think maybe one of the things, Chris and Kirsty, that we'll want to do is, like the value of engagement communication that you sent to the board yesterday, just making sure that we continue to make the board aware of actions that we're taking or others that we're working with, both on our our work on sustainability and climate change, as well as our work around governance and human capital management and inclusion and diversity. We have a long track record. And a solid track record, and we just want to make sure that we continue to, I think, hone in on these same issues, but how everybody's looking at them in a new light, given the pandemic. So, Betty, appreciate you bringing that up. We have a couple of additional comments. First, I'll go to Harry and then to Sharon. Harry?
Thanks, Madam Chair. Really appreciate Kirsty's comments, and of course, I lend my full support to Controller Yee's comments. But I also want to be clear. It's not my intention to throw additional overwhelming work onto the staff and derail a work plan that we've thought about. But I view this whole issue of human capital management not simply something that the investment committee can look at. We may meet as a full board as an investment committee, but I think this year, tomorrow during the work plan adoption, I'll be asking the board to adopt the work plan with flexibility so that we might find some time off cycle to have some conversations about critical issues. This could be simply one of them. And as we, in our CalSTRS approach, is we educate ourselves about what we are doing currently around an issue and what we might be thinking about going forward into the future. It's my view that human capital management and the one example of that is the growing inequities between executive pay and worker pay is something that has been growing for a long period of time that I believe is a risk to the larger society. But how do we narrow that in and focus in on what does that actually mean to the CalSTRS portfolio? What are we doing currently? Who are we collaborating with on these types of issues to talk to companies that we are long-term investors, and how workers are treated, et cetera, is important to us. But this isn't something that we're just going to dump on the staff and say, go do this. We might begin with a 90-minute session sometime this year. What are we doing currently? What is our view around sustainability that also includes human capital management, and what might we want to do in the future? So I just want to be clear about that I have a lot of passion and believe there's a place for this conversation and time for this conversation for us to have as an organization without derailing the work plan that we have in place currently for this year and the transition to a low carbon economy, as well as looking at Asia and China and its role in the portfolio going forward. So I want to just really be clear about that. Thanks. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Harry. Thanks very much for providing the clarifying comments, because I think those are important to make sure that we retain the focus on the items that we've already identified, but think about how to be flexible, because new issues or new approaches to some of these issues will continue to arise. So thank you. Sharon, I'll turn it over to you.
And I'll just end this because I know we're ready to vote. Can you guys all hear me okay? But I just want to lend my support to Betty and Harry's comments. I just think, it just feels like the flexibility we need to have as a board. There's so much going on in our world. And I think between coronavirus and, the race riots and the systemic racism that we're seeing, that's just kind of been revealed through the coronavirus, and the income inequality that's been revealed. These are big issues affecting our world and our country and my town of LA. Your towns. And so I think this issue around the workforce risk, the risk to workers, and how this is impacting Black and Brown workers disproportionately to other workers. I do think it's just a bigger piece of the conversation that I hope we can have. I think we've historically, worked on the E and the G, and I think it definitely feels like the times are revealing working on S and the S part. And I know, Kirsty, you and your team have been doing some thinking. We've been doing some talking together about that issue. So I really look forward to the conversations with our board moving forward. To Harry's comments, we have some topics that we're focused on, but clearly I think the world is revealing some issues that I do think propose some systemic risk to our system in the area of workforce risk. So I look forward to us figuring out ways to talk about that and giving that some airtime in the next year. So appreciate those upcoming conversations.
Great, thank you very much, Sharon. So there aren't any other speakers in the queue. This is an action item, so I would love a motion and a second for the item.
Move approval.
So Sharon moved approval.
Second, Madam Chair.
Gail, thank you. Gail seconds. I see Roslyn on. I think what we need to do is we need to be doing roll call votes given the format that we're in. So Ros, I'll turn it over to you.
So Ms. Bradford?
Yes.
Ms. Hendricks?
Yes.
Mr. Keeley?
Yes.
Mr. Pursuant?
Yes.
Ms. Yamamoto?
Yes.
Ms. Miller for the Director of Finance.
Yes.
State Treasurer Ma.
Yes.
Mr. Yamanaka for the Superintendent of Public Instruction.
Aye.
And Controller Yi. I saw, oh, did you, I think that was a yes, Ms. Yi? Yes. Okay, great.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Rod. Okay, thank you, everyone. So moving on to, we have agenda items 11A and 11B. We are running a little bit behind, and I know that we started a little bit late, but I just want to remind everyone that for these two items, we've got 10 minutes each, so we're trying to complete these two in about 20 minutes. I think, Scott, maybe I'm turning it over to you.
Yes, great. Good morning, members of the board. My name is Scott Chan. I'm the Deputy CIO. And I wanted to introduce this topic by starting with a quick overview of the SISS portfolio. So SISS will be consisting of two components. The first is the existing public equities portfolio that you're familiar with. It contains sustainable investment managers and activist investment managers. And we've been talking about a future portfolio consisting primarily of private markets types of assets. We discussed this in light of an innovation like sleeve to capture ESG type of investments. Today, we're going to be focusing on the SISS public equities portfolio. And specifically, we're recommending a global equity benchmark. And this is the only action item for the board in this item. The SISS policy is unique today in the sense that it does not contain a benchmark. And we wanted to select a benchmark to align the risk return objectives with the goals of CalSTRS fund and how we want to manage global equities in the future at CalSTRS. So I really want to make 3 points, and that's number one, the benchmark that's selected, the MSCI ACWI IMI. It's a global equity benchmark. It better aligns and represents the board's global equity policy benchmark and its objectives. Secondly, it's going to enable our team to manage risk across a range of public equity strategies. And this is consistent with the risk budget approach that we've been pursuing. So it'll be consistent with how we manage global equities, where June and her team have really led the way in the discussion in recommending a risk budget and a global equity benchmark last fiscal year. The second part of the item is a little nuanced, but I just want to run through it briefly, that Makita is recommending the low carbon index be incorporated into SIS's compensation hurdles. So this is not a recommendation for action by the board. This is delegated to our CEO, Jack Ennis. And just quickly, the low carbon index is a special mandate. You'll recall it was suggested by the board and recommended by Global Equities and Makita. And so in this one special mandate case, we believe that it's best to integrate the risk return management into the SISS equity portfolio. The other special mandates will likely remain as special mandates as they are. And so currently, this is being managed by the global equity team, as June mentioned briefly in the last item, with oversight by the SISS team, and it's going to continue to be managed this way. So in conclusion, they'll have roughly $6.5 billion of an equity portfolio, and the inclusion here will help them manage the risk or lower the tracking error risk of the portfolio. We're going to bring back the special mandate policy likely in September or November to formalize the removal of this low carbon index and incorporation into the SISS policy or SISS team. So with that, I'll hand it off to Kirsty.
Thank you, Scott. Hello, everybody on the board. I'm Kirsty Jenkinson, the Director of Sustainable Investment and Stewardship Strategies. It's nice to be with you. If I could go to the next slide, please. I'm presuming somebody else is controlling the slides. Perfect. Great. So the way we're going to run through these this session is I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of the map of the SISS portfolio. I'm going to dial very quickly into the recommendations that we're making today, and then I'm going to hand over to Makita, as Scott has teed up, to give their opinion as well. So on the next slide, I always take this opportunity, as I think is very important, to remind you of the 3 core activity areas for the SISS team. So if we could go to the next slide, please. While these areas overlap in many ways, they are quite distinct strategies. The sustainable investment focuses on how we allocate capital in line with our risk return goals, and this is what we're focusing on today. But when we meet with you, we often talk to you about some of the other items, the stewardship activities. That's how we influence companies and policymakers. And we also have strategic relations as a core part of our team, which is how the investment branch manages our internal and external relationships, including with our diverse range of stakeholders. So again, want to orientate you to the sort of the multi-different sort of approaches. We're only going to be focusing on one today predominantly, which is the sustainable investment piece there. This is mirrored on the next slide when we look at the overview of the SISS policy. Scott has highlighted this, but I just want to be quite clear that the SISS policy is a little bit different to some of the other asset class policies, as it's got a few more sub-segments than other policies. So just to recap, next slide, please. There are these three components. There is the stewardship program policy that governs our stewardship activities. There is the securities litigation policy, which is owned by the Office of our General Counsel and with whom SISS cooperates on the implementation. And then there's the SISS portfolio policy, which relates to our investment activities. And that's, again, what we're focused on today. So again, I know it can get a little bit confusing when our policy looks slightly different to the others, and that's the red line version that you see in front of you. So on the next slide, please, if we look to spending a little bit of time on this roadmap, because I think it is important to sort of orientate you to the trajectory that we're trying to follow. And we recognize that there's quite a few moving parts. So hopefully this will help sort of keep us all on track as to where we've come from, the evolution of the SISS portfolio, and where we hope to go in the future. So at the start of the year in January, which obviously now feels like a completely different lifetime, you approved changes to the stewardship policy and our annual stewardship priorities. And they just came out a little bit in the discussion we were having earlier on the business plan as well. That's corporate and market accountability, board effectiveness with a particular focus on the oversight of human capital management, workforce risks and diversity, the low carbon transition and responsible firearms. And as I alluded to, we've obviously been looking at reflecting on these priorities in light of the pandemic, and we'll be keeping you apprised of those as we go forward. Now, in January, we also had some initial framing discussions about the concept of expanding the investments in the SISS portfolio to include other asset classes, notably private asset classes. And in March, we followed up on some of these initial ideas with some of the examples of the types of investments that could be attractive for the SISS portfolio. That brings us to today, in July, where we're asking you to focus on the recommended changes for the existing SISS portfolio, which is comprised, as Scott said, of public equity assets. So essentially think of it as we're hoping to ensure that we've got the most solid foundation for our current portfolio from which we can develop it further. So we're recommending a new benchmark, a shift in the portfolio construction, all with the express aim of better managing our risk, enhancing our returns, and more broadly aligning with the goals of the total fund. But we know we're not going to achieve everything today. So my colleagues and I, we will be back over the course of the rest of the year to discuss with you a number of other items, how we think about setting appropriate risk budgets for the SISS portfolio. We're following up with more tangible and specific details about the new investments that we hope to make in the SISS portfolio. We will be able to update you on progress on multiple areas of activity in implementing the low carbon transition work plan that affects both the SISS portfolio and the rest of the CalSTRS portfolio. And we'll be making a specific request to adjust the special mandate policy that currently governs the low carbon index. And we're going to be talking about more today. So hopefully that sort of sets the scene. I recognize, again, lots of different parts here that will hopefully give you the trajectory and the sort of the strategic sort of approach we're taking to this. So on the next slide, please, let me summarize the substantive recommendations that we're seeking your approval to change. In a nutshell, we want to be able to manage the current portfolio in a more holistic manner. We want to look at the total portfolio risk return characteristics in order to optimize how it's constructed and aligned with the total fund's goals. I think it's fair to say that the portfolio was traditionally managed in a more siloed manner, and the team and I want to change that and believe it's really going to help us moving forward. And obviously having one global benchmark for the whole portfolio is a critical step, hence our recommendation for the custom MSCI All Country World Investable Market Index, or as it's referred to, the MSCI ACWI IMI. We hope to remove certain geographic designations that mischaracterize our existing strategies. And we hope to be able to consider a range of public equity strategies from active to passive, all of which intentionally integrate a consideration of ESG or sustainability related factors as a value driver in the investment philosophy, the portfolio construction, and the decision-making process. And finally, we're recommending that the CIO or his designee has discretion over the portfolio's risk and allocation in the interim as we work through the current portfolio transition and then refine our recommendations on a risk budget and an allocation range. So on the next slide, just to quickly dive deeper into the recommended change of the benchmark. This slide summarizes our rationale for the selection of the custom MSCI ACWI IMI. But just to spend a moment to highlight the process by which we came to this decision, the SISS team conferred extensively with Chris and with Scott, with the Makita team, with our risk team and our global equity colleagues on the choice of this benchmark in order to better align with the board's policy benchmarks and risk return objectives. And on the next slide, just to provide a little bit more detail on the recommended changes that we're hoping to create in portfolio construction, I'm just laying out here the current components of the SISS public equity portfolio. We're in the process of rebalancing the activist portfolio, which is a particularly high active risk due to its very concentrated nature. We're maintaining the current sustainability focused manager portfolio, but believe there may be merit in reviewing the range of options available for us to invest in. And we're seeking to fully integrate the existing low carbon index, which is currently jointly managed by SISS and our global equity team colleagues. Internally, we hope to integrate that fully into the SISS portfolio and compensation as well, which Makita will comment on shortly. So on my final slide, please, the last one, I'll wrap up about a little bit more about the recommendation to fully integrate the low carbon index into SISS, including our compensation. As I said, we'll be bringing the special mandate policy, which currently governs the low carbon index, back to you for formal approval of this shift in September. But we believe this is a sensible move as the index, as you can see from a portfolio construction perspective, is a very good complement and diversifier for the SISS portfolio and for our wish to manage the portfolio holistically and lower the risk. Clearly, this move also aligns with my team's focus on understanding the low carbon transition and how to work with other asset classes and positioning our total portfolios most effectively for it. And as you know, this is a fundamental part of your work plan. And finally, I think, and it's important mentioning this, but we will come back to this at later discuss meetings, there's been significant developments in the market related to low carbon investment since we funded this strategy 3 years ago. With improved data, with improved analytics, we believe we're in a much better position now to both reduce portfolio carbon emissions and limit active risk, as the current index does, but also consider opportunities to identify some of the possible winners and losers in the low carbon transition and thus create excess returns. The team and I think it's very timely and appropriate to conduct a comprehensive review of this strategy in light of these exciting developments that are happening in the market and the urgency of how we think about these issues, and in light of our current work plan on the low carbon transition. So I'm going to hand back briefly to Scott, who's then going to transition over to Makita as well.
Great. So again, the major ask today is for the approval of the investment benchmark recommendation. And of course, if we change the investment benchmark and include the low carbon index, it's going to have compensation implications for SISS. Makita will preview those implications and the recommendation to Jack, our CEO. And just as a reminder of the process, our CEO has the delegated authority to adopt benchmark changes in the comp policy. So if the investment committee today approves the investment benchmark for SISS, Makita will make a recommendation for compensation changes to Jack, and Jack will decide to approve it or not. It does not go to the compensation committee, but rather at the next board meeting or as soon as practicable, the board will be notified of any compensation changes that Jack has approved. So with that said, I'll hand it off to Makita.
And just before we go to the consultants, I want to acknowledge that we do have a couple board members in queue. So we'll have Makita comment, and then I'll turn to the controller and to Bill. Thank you. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. This is Mika Malone with Makita Investment Group. I think just a couple of brief comments. So there are no slides that you need to focus on for our comments. I'll note that Makita's memo begins on INV 171, if any board members would like to refer to that while I speak. But from Makita's perspective, and I think as Kirsty and Scott have noted very clearly, there are really three main areas which we're asked to weigh in on. One with respect to the benchmark adjustment for SISS. I think moving to the custom ACWI IMI makes very good sense in terms of where the portfolio is going and what the construction looks like. It aligns well with the broad portfolio objectives within global equity as well. So Makita concurs with that recommendation that staff has brought forward. In terms of the low carbon indices, which are already a component of the SISS portfolio, but removing that special mandate tag so that they're more formally incorporated into the broader portfolio, Makita also concurs and believes that's the most appropriate way to look at the portfolio as these have become, I'd say, a core part of the work of the board over the last several years. What moving those more formally into the benchmark and the policy means is that, as Scott mentioned, there would be an implication to the incentive compensation, right? So you went from a very active portfolio, as Kirsty mentioned, to now a portfolio that will have a spectrum of assets, from more passively managed, like the low carbon indices, to more actively managed, as some of your sustainable and activist managers are. This means that from Makita's perspective, the tracking error, so the active risk in the portfolio, will be reduced, and we believe it will be appropriate to consider reducing the scale maximum within the incentive compensation to align with that reduction in active risk in the portfolio. So Makita outlines in our memo where those numbers come from. I'll save most of my comments there, as I know that there'll be further discussion with the CEO, et cetera, but ultimately, we're recommending a 25% reduction in the scale maximum to align with what we believe for this first year, the reduction in total tracking error will be. I did want to just close by noting that this is a portfolio in significant transition, and we believe that all of this should be reevaluated at the end of the fiscal year to identify whether it's working as planned, whether the timing has worked as staff has laid out, and also whether the incentive compensation ranges need to be adjusted based on where the portfolio lands. So I'll close my comments there.
Great, thank you very much, Mika. We'll turn to some board members for some comments or questions. So first, Controller Yee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And first of all, I just want to thank Kirsty and the team for really developing and maturing this portfolio. And I know it is still fairly fluid, but just the tremendous work that's been done on this. Just a request, and not for discussion today, Madam Chair, but perhaps for the September meeting, if we could have a little bit of a deeper dive with respect to how we are going to ensure that the other portfolio managers will be essentially overseeing their own sustainability decisions and not kind of looking to push them to this particular area. I think there may be a tendency to have that happen on the natural, not with any intention, but just if we could get some discussion about that and some assurance about that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I've got that noted. So appreciate that, Betty. We'll go next to Bill.
Thank you, Kirsty, and your team. Once again, a great presentation. Kirsty, you mentioned in your presentation that there were changes in the market in the last few years that enhanced the ability to measure success or failure. What are those changes that have emerged in the market?
Sure, absolutely. And this would probably build on, you might remember again, back in earlier in the year when we, for example, had Brian Deese from BlackRock come and talk a little bit about some of the specific areas where they're seeing, better data availability on understanding, carbon impacts, not only just today from a pure sort of like what does the company's carbon footprint look like, but what what steps are companies taking to help them to be more resilient in a low carbon economy? How can you model and think about that? And then how can you reflect that into a portfolio and potential weightings? So it's elements like that. I put it down to two things. One, we are seeing a lot better sort of professionalism, I would say, across the asset management industry of how they are incorporating climate factors and other ESG factors as well. So this is now not just being done by sort of specialist research groups, but it's been done by sort of like bulge bracket asset managers and really kind of like the smartest minds that we have, kind of thinking about how to integrate this into, you know, really thoughtful financial decision making. And then I would say it is back to that data. You know, this is also, you know, groups now through, whether it be machine learning, whether it be through sort of ability and AI, we're seeing huge, much more capturing of data that is going to be more helpful to us as an investor to understand a company's future resilience to a changing world. And that's what we think is most important for us to try and capture.
I think it might be helpful, and I don't want to put any more on your plate, but just to have maybe a short description of what's happening in this area, because I think it is really vital to demonstrate that there is a quantitative means of measuring the portfolio's carbon-free portfolio.
Sure, and I will caveat, Bill, you know, there are still constraints. I don't want to make it sound like the work has all been done and everything is crystal clear, but it's certainly different to where it was even a couple of years ago. And again, back on that sort of the pace of change of that we are seeing, I think it's very appropriate that we can give you some updates on what that looks like, and it's still where we need to head, but what's happened certainly in the last couple of years.
And just one more final question. What was the group that presented at our last offsite last October that we've used to assist us in measuring that?
Sure, absolutely. I think you're referring to Rhodium Group that came and presented to us at the offsite. We've had a number of discussions with them, not least with our real estate team and colleagues, thinking about physical risk as it affects our real estate assets. We've got a number of exciting updates that I think we can provide to you on how they've been extremely helpful to us on that. So hopefully we'll have a chance to sort of go through blow by blow much of the work plan that we've been focused on the low carbon transition, both from a physical risk perspective, which Rhodium has been helping us with, and on a transition risk perspective, which is more about policy and technology change, that I think other experts are also working with us on. So yeah, great, happy to.
Many thanks.
Great, thank you, Bill. Next we'll go to Gail and then to Harry. Gail?
Thank you, Madam Chair. A couple of questions, and thank you for the presentation. That was really helpful. On some of the, you know, we've talked a lot about kind of risk and how we're doing these risk budgets, which we've been huge advocates of. Could you talk a little bit about how the SISS portfolio will participate in the risk budgets?
Yeah, and maybe I'll just jump in quickly on that one, Kirsty. So again, SISS is going to likely be managing two components in the portfolio. The first one being the public equity portfolio, which we very much wanted to, again, choose a benchmark, which is the starting point for us for that risk management, to the degree that the benchmark aligns with the board policy benchmarks. And, you know, it indeed does. And the second is then to manage the tracking or error or the relative risk around that and develop a risk budget. And it has phenomenal implications for the way we are going to manage that risk. And if you can think about the portfolio construction that Kirsty laid out in those three components with the activist sustainable portfolio and the low carbon index now, if that's incorporated, then, you know, essentially a risk budget was going to allow them to optimize that portfolio where every risk they take to the benchmark, which is aligned to our policy benchmark, generates a commensurate amount of return that is sufficient. And that just, you know, I can't emphasize that this is the starting point of risk management and construction in the SISS portfolio, because uniquely it doesn't have a benchmark. And so we will be recommending a risk budget either in the September or the November meeting as we look forward to continue to align this portfolio underneath the best practices. And I think that, again, was set forward in our global equity team led by June. We want this portfolio to be managed similarly.
Great. Thank you. I really appreciate that and think it's really important. I actually saw on INV 137 there is a benchmark. There's no benchmark? I'm sorry.
There are benchmarks for every managers, and I just want to make sure that you understand that that's going to continue.
I just thought I heard you say there was no benchmark. Okay, thank you.
There's actually no formal benchmark in the policy for SISS, which is what we're correcting, because we want to manage the overall portfolio underneath an aggregate benchmark that makes sense for CalSTRS.
Okay, got it. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Great, thank you, Gail. Harry.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I do have a couple of questions, but I can follow up with Mika offline. It's really around the cost of the portfolio, reducing the volatility and diversifying a little bit, really moving away from what the original activist portfolio was. And it's now, I think this portfolio, if my back of the envelope is correct, will represent about 3% of the overall portfolio. So it's not immaterial. And my hope is that this will help us over the long term get to that 7% hurdle that really is the ultimate goal. So in the interest of time, I want to move the recommendation on INV 140.
Thank you, Harry. Was that Betty? Who's seconding?
Gail.
It was
Gail.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, I see a screen of people. I wasn't sure. Thank you. Okay, so we have a motion by Harry and a second by Gail. Roz, you'll take the vote.
Great. So Ms. Bradford?
Yes.
Ms. Hendricks?
Yes.
Mr. Keeley?
Yes.
Mr. Pursuant?
Yes.
Ms. Yamamoto?
Yes.
Ms. Miller for the Director of Finance?
Yes.
Mr. Saha for the State Treasurer?
Yes.
Mr. Yamanaka? Let's see. Oh, excuse me. Okay, Controller Yi?
Aye.
Great. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. So we're going to move next to item 11B, and I just want to do a time check with everyone. You know, I think we were trying to adjourn the morning part of our meeting by 10:30. That was ambitious, but I do think that we can get through the next few items that we had scheduled through lunch by 11. And if we can do that, then that'll give everybody a break from 11 to 12:30 before we start in the afternoon with our speaker. So I just ask people to keep that in mind as we try to move through the next few items. So going to 11B, I think, Geraldine, am I turning it to you? Welcome.
Sure. Good morning, Madam Chair.
Good morning. Good morning, Geraldine.
Good morning. This item should help with your time because it's fairly straightforward. There are two major changes. One would align the SISS recommendations you just approved in this overarching policy. So it's adding the benchmark information that you just approved. It also is changing its name to SISS because it keeps referring to it as corporate governance, so that will be aligned also. The second change is with the asset allocation long-term targets you approved in November, you had a first step. This is us coming back as we expected, right, in 6 months with our first step. It is slightly modified than the step we have in the policy because of market movements. We tried to tighten up as closely as possible our portfolio with this step. So some of them are slightly different. I itemize them in the agenda item, but they're fairly small. So overall, we're recommending these two changes to the overarching policy. We do recommend them for July 1st because it's kind of a nice, beginning of the fiscal year, and we are managing the portfolio to these new targets. Hopefully you approve them. And then we'd probably be back in December or 6 months from now with the next step change. So I'll leave it at that. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to drill down any further on any of these areas.
Okay, we do have one comment in the queue. Gail?
Thanks, Madam Chair, and I apologize. I'll make it really quick. We just are curious about the market value of the 1% adjustments to step 1 in the board item. Happy, Geraldine, if you want to follow up on that. And why are we going retroactive to July 1st? We just want to make sure that, have we seen kind of that retroactive adjustment before? And obviously when we look at this writ large, we just get concerned when we see those types of adjustments. So happy if you want to follow up on those though as well, in the interest of time.
Geraldine, if I can jump in on the retroactive, I understand that we've had board members in the past raise that they don't like retroactive, and I agree. A big part of it though is that back in the May meeting, we really don't know where the private assets are going to end by June 30. And so trying to change that is just so difficult and anticipate where it is. I'm even worried about, we're raising private equity up 1%. Right now, we're halfway in between those two. So we start the year a little bit underweight. But from performance measurement standpoint, because of all the reporting that we do, it is so much cleaner to start right at the beginning of a quarter end, particularly really every 6 months. It's June 30 and December 30 that makes a clean performance reporting, all of the different external reports, and even compensation. So that's our reason for our request. Real estate obviously might have some more write-downs, but we think that's reasonable to increase 1%. And it's aspirational, but we have a lot of dry powder that we've committed in private equity. So I'm worried about increasing that, but I think that's the right thing to do. The next step in the future would be shifting 1% over to RMS. And then obviously our goal is to continue to grow inflation sensitive and private equity. So we'll look at this every 6 months. Next meeting would be November. Hopefully the world isn't as volatile as it has been, so we could do it prospectively rather than retroactively.
Yeah, that's certainly our preference. This is a little bit concerning. So do we know what the market value then of the 1% adjustments are in total, or just like?
Well, frankly, most of them are actually made, because the state has grown to 14%. And it really has to do with the denominator, how big the total fund is. It looked like we crossed about 250 billion, pretty steady at June 30, or right in here. So if you do approve this, I'll send out my mid-month asset allocation report tomorrow. We're actually pretty darn close to these actual targets.
Oh, okay.
As we came close to writing this item, we were adjusting real estate or private equity, trying to estimate that March 31 write up or write down in value.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I don't see any other speakers in the queue. I'll just pause. I don't know if Makita or any of the consultants have any comments on this, or if we can go to a vote. Okay. I'm sorry, Harry. I have to do it.
I could highlight. Okay, good.
Okay, I was just going to move the recommendation found on INV 177. And for the record reference, Makita's support for this item in their memo found on page INV 178 and 179. So the motion is to approve the recommendation.
Second.
Thank you. So Harry made the motion and Bill seconded. Alan, I see you up. Any very brief comments you have?
No, we're fully supportive. We were involved in all the discussions and support the recommendation.
Okay, thank you very much. And Harry, thank you for referencing their memo in the materials as well. So Rosin, we have a motion and a second.
Okay, so Ms. Bradford?
Yes.
Ms. Hendricks?
Yes.
Mr. Keeley?
Yes.
Mr. Pursuant?
Yes.
Ms. Yamamoto?
Yes.
Ms. Miller for the Director of Finance?
Yes.
Mr. Saha for the State Treasurer?
Yes.
And Controller Yee?
Aye.
Great, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Okay, I think everyone knows where item number 12 is our speaker, which is what we'll start the afternoon session with at 12:30. So we will move to item number 13, Chris, for our CIO report.
There we go. Thank you. If we could bring up those slides real quick. Turn the page. There we go. I said earlier 250 billion. I correct myself. We were 246 at June 30. Present today, for the teachers that are paying attention, we're really at about 250 because of the market rally. So obviously, as you know, it's been very volatile. Hit an all-time record high mid-year in December before COVID, the crisis hit, and we experienced lots of volatility. I have said to many of you, boy, only being up, about 10 billion on the year doesn't feel good because we want to make around 15 to 20 billion a year. But compared to where we were at March 31st, I feel a lot better. So the assets are, that is a record fiscal year end close for us at 246. I should know the return numbers here shortly. I guess I would revise the estimate I sent out to you. I think we'll hopefully, knock on some wood for Micah, we'll be roughly between 3.5, maybe just shy of 4. Obviously not great on the fiscal year because we want 7, but it's great to be positive. Most of our peers I'm hearing from different sources are landing around 2% to 3%. So we actually might look good. Any fund that had a large exposure to government bonds will do extremely well. As I told you in an earlier email, the top 5 stay-at-home stocks all had, as a group, a 25% return last fiscal year. The next highest returning asset class was U.S. government bonds, almost 25% positive result. Outside the USA, the world was very choppy. And I mentioned that of all places, New Zealand is the one country that had a positive 13% return in US dollars. We have exposure there, but not much. If you turn the page. Here's our asset allocation. And as you can see, when you look to the new targets that you've adopted, we're actually very close. And this is what we think is the correct June 30 numbers that will go out. As I mentioned, private equity at 9.6, roughly 9.5. It's a little underweight, that new 10% target. Real estate's right at its target. The next shift, as you can see, RMS at 8.5%. We took some profits there, but that also just had to do with changes in the overall global equity portfolio. As it grew, RMS did not move as much. And remember, RMS, and we'll talk about that later, but RMS does well in market declines, which happened in the first quarter, but it is going to be slow to recover in market climbs like we experienced in April, May, and June. And as I've discussed with you many times, that rise surprised so many people that it's very hard to readjust. We're very heavy in cash. As I've told you, we are continuing to hoard cash. And if we need to overlay that into the portfolio, the global equity weighting is now where we went from being underweight. We're now actually at market weight, and we're likely to take profits. We think there are risks on the horizon. So if you turn the page. Here's the U.S. stock market last fiscal year. You may have to move your Zoom, at least I do. You can see the enormous breakdown that we felt in February to March. That low is March 23, and then the real surprising recovery. People are now going back and rewriting history and saying this isn't a bear market. It's more like a flash crash. It meets the conventions, frankly, of a bear market. And I think that, as I've said to you, the biggest change and the surprise of the speed of that April, May, June rally, which was historic in terms of the market rebounding, really has a lot to do with the pandemic and stay at home. They are now realizing that you basically have the entire finance industry working from home. If they're, and I think I'm similar, where you've got CNBC or Bloomberg on TV. Some of us have access to Bloomberg. People have time in their hands. We suddenly have found that we have millions and millions of day traders. And as I've given you examples of Hertz, most recently Tesla stock, stocks are seeing 2 to 3 times their total outstanding shares traded within a day, meaning people are holding stocks for minutes, not even days, and flipping them around. So this unusual activity actually has had a profound effect on the USA. And I think it will diminish over time as people go back to work, but we're still in a health crisis. And I'll go through the risks in a minute. Next up would be a longer term picture of the US equity markets. So turn the page. Here it is over the last 4 years. So you can really see the depth of that spike in March, how much we have recovered. But it certainly has been a volatile market even over these time periods. Next page. Here's the non-US market. And most importantly, the recovery in March, April, May has been slower. It has recovered, but much slower. You still have the questions, Brexit has now happened, but you still have the questions of the UK. Growth in France and Germany is weak. Growth in Japan continues weak. So this is the developed market index, which again is about half Japan or a quarter Japan, a quarter the UK, and then the rest the world. So non-US stocks were flat on the year, slightly negative for us. And anybody with a global portfolio like us will have that drag. Any pension plan or investor that had a US-centric plan will see a better result on the year. Next page. The yield curve, dramatic shift down, as we have discussed, with the Federal Reserve intervention, moving interest rates basically back to zero. So the whole curve, remember 6 months ago, we were worried about the curve flattening, and that's signaling and going inverted, and that's signaling a potential recession. Obviously, no one predicted a pandemic creating a recession. But what we have seen now is the curve is positively sloped, but you can see through 3 years, it's virtually flat. Now, an important point is the Federal Reserve, because they've just thrown themselves at everything. They're trying to even to the point of influencing corporate bonds, the equity markets in different ways. They are talking about one last tool is trying to control the shape of this yield curve. And that will obviously be a challenge. There's different mechanisms on how they would do that. But that 30-year rate, you can see it such a tremendously low level, and the 10-year rate below 1%. Interest rates are low and are going to stay low. So that's going to be a challenge. Now, a lot of people think that's going to doom returns going forward. But what we saw in 2010, 11, 12, when interest rates were this low, was that it stimulates risk assets. It's easy to borrow money and leverage and buy things. And so risk assets actually do better. We're going to have to wait till the COVID crisis, the health crisis, is resolved. But the Fed has said lower for longer again in interest rates and signaled their moves. Next page. So here are the risks. If I climb up the to the crow's nest, here are the risks that we have continued to see. The pandemic, I have mentioned to you many times, there are numerous vaccines. Credit to Gail Miller. She sent me a link to the New York Times, has a vaccine tracker that is just excellent, really shows you real time how many vaccines are under evaluation, how many are in human trials, where they are in their human trials. As the Milken Institute Faster Cures told us last time, you've got over 12 vaccines to 15 that are going through human trials. The odds are very good. You will find something that works, but it still may take until the end of the year. And then the odds situation, if you've read about it, glass makers have a shortage of glass. They would have to make glass vials for almost every person on the planet. And that is posing a problem. So I still think once we do have a vaccine, this is still going to be choppy. question about how many people will take the vaccine. But if we look out to 2021, 22, we may get back to somewhat of a regular world, although, as we've all said, it will be different than we are today. The positives still remain. Unprecedented government intervention. Federal balance sheet is multiples of where it was in 2008. And obviously, you've seen the market rallies on any news about a vaccine or a treatment. We all think that that's very far ahead because you still have an immense amount of unemployed. As we've said, Main Street and Wall Street are completely disconnected. Next page. So a couple of the risks, and I guess I would change. We obviously have been very concerned about the protests and the social unrest. The things that are coming up, I would mention that we had the U.S. election on here as a risk. I realize now I took it off. What I would have shared with the board, and one of my concerns, is a contested U.S. election. We're really setting up, and that's an active discussion of the potential of a risk that the U.S. election does not go well because of mail-in voting and a lot of uncertainty and protests. That level of uncertainty would be a tremendous threat to the U.S. market. And then obviously the angst of Black Lives Matter, the crushing situation of that we're facing in the USA and the attention that it's being drawn to it, I think is critical. As you've said, human capital management is a critical area of focus for us. So these risks remain on the horizon. I shared with the board some information about earthquakes from National Geographic. I think that's something we always watch, but any of these could pop up as a threat to what we're doing. And obviously, as we get into the fall, we're going to be back with having to worry about wildfires, particularly in the state of California. And that means electrical grid shutdowns. So that concludes the vast majority of my report. We will be putting out our June 30 returns probably in a press release next week. I'll make sure that I email all of those to you once we know them. The 3-year return, which is important from an actuarial standpoint, is pointing to around 6.5% net. So close to 7, but close does not count. All those old adages about close not counting. That is true when it comes to funding this plan in actuarial sciences. 6.5 doesn't cut it. So it's going to put pressure on the funding plan and pressure on the funding level of the plan. We're dropping a good year from 3 years ago. So fiscal year 2021, it's going to be important for us to produce a solid positive return. Over 30 years, the plan's been returning about 8%, but it's not been a smooth 8%. The difference between an average return and the geometric return are pretty sizable because we've had such wide swings in the return in the last half of that 30-year period. But I'll have a whole summary out for you as soon as those numbers are posted. With that, I'll open it to questions.
Chris, I maybe we'll jump in. We don't currently have any questions in queue, but I just wanted to tee up. We've had some discussion on the call already about some of the issues that have arisen related to COVID-19, and I know that there's been some discussion that our real estate staff has had around working with our real estate partners to make sure that the workplace is safe as workers come back in. So I wondered if you could make a few comments about that, or if Mike or his team might.
Sure. And Michael, why don't you come on the line? I would say when it comes to CalSTRS, again, kudos to the IT department. Ashish and his team have just been amazing. I think we're actually fairly efficient at working remote, particularly with the trade desks. The challenge remains in private equity and real estate and infrastructure because those are much more interactive areas and investments. The lack of travel makes it difficult. We are seeing funds continue to close and we are making some investments. We're also seeing opportunities to take advantage of the situation in terms of distressed credits and helping companies. In terms of our staff, I just saw this morning that Cassandra Licknock sent out an email in line with the governor's recommendations that we will probably extend any return to the office out to September instead of looking in August. And I can tell you from our staff, I've done town halls with the investment staff. The vast majority of them all want some ability to work from home from now on. And over 90% are still very concerned about coming back into an office environment, even with wearing masks. There's a desire to continue to work from home. So for now, we'll have to stay in that environment, but it is going to have profound impacts in what we think of office buildings and the compaction of office buildings. Mike, do you want to share some experiences?
And Mike, I don't know if you're coming online, but I think that maybe my specific question was around any discussion that we're having with some of our real estate partners about how they're being responsive to their workers, some of the labor unions that are I think wanting to make sure that our partners are taking the precautions that they need to.
And thank you, Joy. I'm glad you brought that back up. I had that note. We had received letters from SEIU, particularly about Elcor and some of our other managers trying to make sure that they're doing everything they can in terms of worker safety. Responded. All of our managers are taking the cutting edge steps in terms of worker safety, in terms of masks and social distancing. Obviously, many of our office buildings are vacated, but that is a paramount issue for us and all of our managers. Mike, can you come on and talk about Elcor in specific?
Yeah, just to reiterate what you're saying, Chris, I think that our partners are leaders in how to manage buildings effectively and safely. It's actually, in some ways, a very good time to test new systems and everything because across the country, most of the office buildings are closed. Most of our partners are having regular conversations with their managers on the janitorial and security staffs to make sure that they and the unions that represent them, if that's the case, are involved in laying out safety procedures for when reopening happens. And we are monitoring that situation and having our partners report to us any new issues that are coming up. But I believe we are in the forefront of making sure this happens in a safe way going forward.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Mike, and thanks, Chris. Controller Yi, do you have any questions? Or are you good? I saw your hand up earlier and wanted to make sure.
Yeah, you just asked my question, Joy. It was really the broader issue about worker safety in our commercial and real estate buildings. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, Chris, we don't have any other questions in queue, so thank you very much. And just again, kudos to you and your team for everything that you all have done to manage the volatility and the uncertainty, and kind of bring us through year end. We look forward to seeing the release with the official numbers, and then looking ahead to next year. So thank you. All right, our last agenda item before we go into a midday break is agenda item number 14. An update on the collaborative model. So it's Scott and Lisa. So welcome. Hi, Lisa. Good to see you. And Scott, welcome back. And just as a reminder, we'll obviously take the time that we need to for any questions from the board. But we're going to try to wrap up as close to 11 as we can.
Sounds good.
Great. Yeah. Thank you. We'll try to make this a condensed version. I know we've been going a little bit long. So let me just make 4 points to start off with. The first is that the collaborative model investment strategy continues to be successful. And as Chris was saying, bending the curve. So I just wanted to give you some of the more recent analysis we've done. Over the past 3 years, we've hired roughly 27 investment professionals. And of that cost us roughly $7 million. So it was expensive from that perspective, but we can attribute roughly $54 million in cost savings to those 27 investment professionals we hired on an annual basis. So as Chris was saying, it roughly an 8-to-1 return on that investment. Moreover, and it was a decent time for some of those divisions, but we can attribute about $3.5 billion of excess returns, which is a tremendous amount. The second thing I wanted to discuss is that the Pillars project remains broadly on track. You see the green in the chart, and we're measuring it from an aggregate perspective. So as you know, we developed really a strategic plan around this with objectives and deliverables and action items. And so what you're seeing in that chart is the aggregation of that. And I know that, on the minute details, there's a few yellows but mostly greens across that. To that regard, I want to credit the team. We had a lot of momentum, and I think the really credit goes to the team, the sponsors, the leaders, the working groups that are in attachment 3, I believe, in the item. So it's all their great ideas, the hard work, and the collaboration across the divisions that make this possible. The second thing I would point out is that, thank goodness we had developed this strategic plan, because who could have foreseen the pandemic and the crisis we're in, but we're able to maintain, to be on track. We're not going to lose track of that because we have it all codified. And, again, I would just, want to give kudos to Joy, who really recommended a monitoring process, as well as the ESM team led by Jan Spano, where we put all this together, and of course all the teams that came together to do this. I think it's really kept us on track. The third, while we have a lot of momentum now, I do want to say that I would expect a few future delays, because the longer we work in a remote environment and we're prevented from meeting face-to-face, those areas are necessarily going to see delays. You can think about recruiting. It's going to be very difficult for us to meet face-to-face for some time with some of our candidates. The fourth, and I think there's a lot to the objectives and items you might be reading, but if I were just to clarify in one statement, what is our biggest challenge today in the Pillar project, in the collaborative model? It is simply recruiting. We do have some those uncontrollable issues, obviously. We don't know the course of the pandemic and when we'll be able to meet face-to-face on a typical basis. But on the other end, we're facing significant compensation issues in recruiting talent. And I guess who would have guessed that as well? Because you would think that in a typical recession, there would be wholesale teams we might be able to pick up because people are getting laid off. It's a difficult time. But it happens that in the area we recruit in investment management, that's just not happening. People are gainfully employed. There's less unemployment. People are actually also getting bonuses. So it's very difficult for us to compete, and we're losing candidates on that end. The other issue we have is that new candidates are coming in, and necessarily they're bumping into the top end of the ranges when we bring them in, which I think creates internal equity issues with the current staff that are currently executing the cloud model. And we've been very successful in doing that thus far. So with that said, I want to hand it off to Lisa, who will start to talk about some of the accomplishments.
Thanks, Scott. There's, I would say the last 2 reporting periods have really been what I call the data collection and analysis period, where the pillar groups are working really closely with our continuous improvement team, identifying the pain points and the bottlenecks of our current processes, and documenting a to-be process with new solutions to ensure and support optimal efficiency over all of the pillars. And although this project was born to support the collaborative model, I would say that these more efficient processes are going to benefit and support the organization as a whole. And so I want to quickly go over a few of the highlights for each of the pillars, starting with HR, which you've heard earlier from Chris is the key to the success of the collaborative model moving forward, because we need to bring in that needed talent. The first objective really relates to recruitment. How are we going to attract the talent we're looking for, and can we make the process more efficient? What we've implemented so far is a new model where our HR specialists are now consulting with investment management hiring managers for each vacant position, rather than just reviewing a package that's sent in from a business HR liaison. So basically what we're doing is we're creating customized job opportunity bulletins for each specific position. And it's not just to talk about the job duties, but it's to identify the necessary competencies and the personal characteristics for each position. So each position job opportunity bulletin that will go out will be specific to the duties and to the characteristics we're looking for that particular position. And not only is this going to save time, but it's going to really make sure that we have a quality candidate pool in the future. Additionally, once the hire is made, you heard Chris talk about the culture. And so the Pillar team has identified the need to ensure that the current culture and the investment branch is maintained. And so one of the deliverables is the objective to develop an onboarding experience document that's consistent throughout the asset classes. We might attract somebody from a financial institution globally, and it might be that environment they came from is very different to the environment we work in at CalSTRS, where everybody is very collaborative and very respectful of one another, all looking to the common goal. So how can we make sure that the experience for employees coming in across the asset classes are consistent? And then the next objective is related to succession planning. And so a succession planning model was created that identifies the competencies necessary to fill the more senior positions. And then the organizational development team is working with investments to identify the future development opportunities that are necessary for internal staff to be ready for those positions. So what are those competencies, and how are we supporting the organization internally to make sure that those people that are ready for those positions have the training and development that they need in order to learn those competencies that may be necessary. Moving on to procurement, there are two objectives in this pillar. The first one is to negotiate legislation to amend the teacher's retirement law to grant the board authority over the procurement process. And the second objective is to establish an expedient and efficient process. So I would say an extensive amount of research, as well as a number of surveys, were completed with national peer groups and other professional groups to help inform that language of the legislative bill AB 2510 to streamline our investment procurement efforts. And although the bill did not go forward this year due to the COVID pandemic, it will be reintroduced in the next legislative cycle. But in anticipation of this approval, the new process in which investment partners will be procured is currently under development with procurement, the CIT team, and our investment partners, and will eventually be provided to you for your approval, because the board would then have the approval over the procurement process moving forward. But while we wait, we have made huge strides in streamlining our current process. During the last 2 quarters, the Pillar team has implemented DocuSign, kind of out of necessity with the environment that we're in, for contracts. We've developed a webpage for electronic submission of bids from our vendors. And we've developed templates for business areas to use that improve the quality of the documents that are submitted. All of these processes are going to definitely save time in the overall process. And on the travel front, the heaviest travel users in investment and our retirement readiness division were interviewed based on the traveler experience and pain points in the process. All of the existing travel processes were mapped to identify complexities and bottlenecks. And the data was then themed, and possible solutions to the issues were identified. So we're making huge progress on the travel front for sure. And the reason why it was important to get this one kind of ahead of some of the other pillars is CalSTRS is also in the process of implementing a new mobile software tool called Concur, which integrates the booking of travel with the reimbursement process. And what this will do is allow the traveler to change flights more easily, to scan receipts for reimbursement, and basically it will allow the traveler to complete their travel request form on their Uber ride home from the airport. As you know, there's investments, especially, there's some investment professionals that work for CalSTRS that maybe travel five times in a month. And so basically they're not getting reimbursed for that first travel claim before they have to go on their next one. And so we really wanted to make sure what the traveler experience felt like, and we're trying to resolve some of those issues that have come up in thinking about that. So those are the big 3 for me, and I'm going to turn it back over to Scott to show some highlights on the other progress of some of the other pillars.
Great. So I'm going to cover the hybrid category, and I'm going to start with technology and just pull out a few things that they've created a holistic data strategy vision. You heard a little bit from Mike and others that financial services is behind in terms of data management, but we want to develop a unified system where we can aggregate the data across our platforms so we can make better informed decisions and also attribute those decisions and historically review them. They've also been able to put in place a CRM system in the private markets, which is going to be very helpful for us to track our deals and pipeline. They can better collaborate and communicate across the platform so people know what each other are doing. And more importantly, as we go into partnership negotiations, we have at our fingertips the assets under management, the fees we're paying, what's in the pipeline, and it's leading to more effective results in our negotiations. Secondly, we have the legal component of the hybrid pillar. I think they've done a good job of developing a plan around the future needs. We've talked about the collaborative model, and it's kind of throwing a pebble into the pond. And if we're accelerating and bulking up our staff and moving forward, then the rest of the organization needs to as well. So they've developed a human capital strategy around that from a legal perspective. And they've also been able to help streamline some of these processes as well, because we're in this remote working environment. Finally, the communications team, they've been able to define the collaborative model succinctly, which I think will be coming to you soon in maybe a couple of pages, so that you'll be able to communicate the collaborative model succinctly and effectively to others. And they've drafted a communication strategy and outreach plan. The financial services segment is our newest pillar, and I suspect by the next update, we will have filled in the objectives and action plans for that piece of it. So with that being said, I want to open it up for some Q&A.
Okay, we have Bill in queue. Bill, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to build on the comments I made earlier about the collaborative model. And one area that I think that we need clearly need a more robust move, and that's in the communications end. To the extent that we are changing the way we do business, and foreseeably, we will even change more dramatically, given the change that has occurred, globally in every respect on every business. And I think that we need to really describe the savings that can be attained in a way and communicate it with not only our members so that we have that support. I think it's vital that we have the support of our membership, as well as public figures, legislators, that they have to understand that this model is the first step into really producing more robust returns for the fund at a time when that is the key to really meet the moment of funding these pensions. We've got to do that. And so I just want to, again, congratulate Scott and the team on the Pillars project, because I think we're moving in the right direction. But I think that we have to do this in a much more aggressive way. I mean, I know I've spoken to Scott about this and others. We don't have a lot of time, and we move slowly within government and at CalSTRS. And I think that whatever we can do as board members to push this, we've got to do this, because it's just going to become much more difficult to really fund these pensions unless we build a model that can reduce costs and therefore increase returns. So I just wanted to build on that, because I think for me, it is one of the most important issues we face.
Bill, thank you so much for your comments. And, I wholeheartedly concur. I think that the committee, Scott and Lisa, have made clear, over the past several months how important we think this project is, and it's just underscored both by Bill's comments now, as well as some of the comments that we heard earlier during the discussion of the work plans. I think that we all not only support it, but also are now that we've started to try to attach some numbers to what we think will be the decreased costs for the fund, and in terms of maximizing our bang for the buck. The other thing I think that's really important is, as you continue to work on the Pillars project and report progress to us, if you start to see any of the action items be delayed, go off schedule, run into roadblocks, I think it'll be really critical for you to escalate as appropriate or inform the board, because if that means that we need to reassess some of the estimates or projections that we've made in terms of what we think will be savings or reduced cost. I think we want to know that, and to be able to feed that information into the kind of sort of advocacy and strategic approach that we talked about and that Bill outlined.
Certainly. Some of these processes we're putting in place, we won't know if they're successful until we have our first couple of hires or our first couple of contracts that are put in place with the new process. And so it's gonna have to be fluid. We're gonna have to look at what we think are the answers and the solutions and see whether or not there's any tweaks that need to be made to make sure that the process is going to work for all of the different administrative areas that we're looking to support this strategy moving forward.
Great, okay. Thank you. Well, there aren't any other questions on this item. So Scott and Lisa, thank you, and great work that you're doing both to move this forward as well as just to keep the board apprised. I did want to make a comment that I neglected to make earlier, which is that, in addition to the public comment that we had to open the meeting, there is an opportunity for the public to also comment after the agenda items. Our team managing the meeting has been keeping an eye on our public comment line, and so far this morning we've had no other speakers request to make public comment, but I did just want to go on the record to say that we're watching that, and we'll pull people in if there are speakers that come in for future agenda items. So that takes us to our last item before the break. I think what we're doing now is we're going on break, and then we are going to resume. I guess we ask all the board members to make sure to kind of come back in by around 12:20, or 12:25, just to make sure all your technology is working, because we want to start promptly at 12:30, which is when we'll have our speaker from Bloomberg. Roz, I see you just rejoined us. Is there? I don't think this was an action item, but are there any comments that you have?
No, I wasn't sure if you wanted to do. I have one additional information request, but do you want to wait till after the board meeting, after the speaker?
Yeah, if we could do that, could we cover the information request after the speaker before we go into closed session?
Okay, great. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Okay. Well, thanks, everyone. Thanks for a really productive morning, and we'll be back online in a little over an hour. Thank you. Okay, great. I think we're live. So welcome back, everyone, to the resumption of our investment committee open session. We are at agenda item number 12, which is a presentation by our investment insight speaker. I'll turn it over to Chris Ailman to introduce Ethan and kind of set the table for our discussion. But I did want to let board members know that what we'd like to do is have Ethan present and hold questions until the end of the discussion, and then we'll run through any questions or comments that you all have. So Chris, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Joy. I want to welcome Ethan Zindler to our webcast. Ethan is head of the Americas for Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Bloomberg New Energy Finance is really a leader in researching energy of all types around the globe. Where energy demand will be, and then where the energy supply is going to come from. We're one of the few pension plans that are members of BNEF. I have been to their annual conferences, probably about 75% of them, with a handful of people. Incredibly educational. One of the few conferences I go to, and I'm spending most of the time Googling terms and things that I'm not used to about distributable grids and things. But Ethan is really here to really go through kind of their forecasts for the future, give you a high-level view on energy and especially what the sources are. And I have challenged many of you to ask him questions, so he is ready. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Ethan Zindler.
Chris, thanks so much, and great to see you. And thanks to you and to Kirsty and to Joy for hosting me, and Chris for Jack for hosting me today. Really an honor to be here. It looks like a nice blue sky day out there at CalSTRS based on all your backgrounds. Welcome to my attic here in Alexandria, Virginia. I'm going to chat for about 30 minutes about our long-term view of the future of energy and decarbonization overall. Were these more normal circumstances, I would say interrupt me and I'll answer questions as I go. But I would say save them for the end. It's just easier over Zoom. Next slide, please. Real quick, as was mentioned, and I won't try to explain this first slide to you, but Bloomberg NEF is a division of Bloomberg that is focused on the energy transition writ large. We started by focusing on renewables, but we've expanded out to look at all areas of the circular economy, various cross-cutting technologies, different areas really across the entire economy that we think are being fundamentally changed by a move towards lower carbon. Like I said, I'm not going to walk you through each one of these icons, but I'll probably touch on a bunch of these different areas as I speak over the next 30 minutes. Next slide, please. So BNEF, I would suggest one fairly simple thesis that we believe very strongly in. And if you could click through each one of these right away, just to put them all up on the screen. The first is that how the world generates and consumes energy is all changing very, very quickly and very substantially. I'll show you a lot of slides that kind of go up and to the right, and some important ones that go down to the right as well. Our second view is that the change presents really substantial challenges and opportunities for the incumbents and for the newcomers, respectively. Third is that a massive amount of new investment has already been deployed to support these changes. And I'll show you a few charts on that. Fifth is that some areas of the economy are definitely moving faster towards decarbonizing than others are. And some are, we have some technologies that are very viable right now, some that are really on the cusp of viability, and then some that frankly are ways from being there. And as a result, fossil fuels are still very much very relevant towards serving those parts of the economy. On climate change, I think it's important to note that there has been some really important progress that has been made to date, and we are moving in the right direction in a number of areas. But most importantly, we don't think we're moving nearly fast enough. And if there are not major policy changes, we won't be able to address climate change. Next, I would say that more change is inevitable, and I always try and say this to in the investment community, which is that there's always the default assumption is that doing nothing is a conservative position. But I would say if you look at the level of change that we've seen in energy and transportation in the last 10 years, you could have lost a lot of money just by standing pat and not thinking about the dynamics underway. So the status quo and assuming it, I think, is potentially the riskiest bet you can make overall. And then finally, I will not go into great depth about COVID-19, but I would just say that it is dramatically complicating the picture overall. And I'll try and show a few slides at the end if we have time on that, because frankly, it is really changing the perspective on a number of these things. So the next slide, please. Sorry, I've got a little delay on my end. I know that you as a group heard from my friend Trevor Hauser of the Rhodium Group, and you've been briefed on climate. So I'm not going to dwell too long here, but suffice it to say that the rate at which we've seen CO2 emissions rising, the amount that have been going into the atmosphere has very dramatically accelerated, really since 1950, but even since 2000. And you can see that the sources are gas, liquids, and solid fuels, each making up an important portion of it. Next slide, please. And I believe the next slide will show that last year was the second hottest year that we've recorded on record. And again, without dwelling too much on it, the issue around climate change is no longer theoretical. It's definitely with us, and we're seeing the impact of it right now. Next slide, please. If we look, though, one of the things that I think is worth noting is that when I mentioned earlier that there's been some progress to date, is that we have seen emissions slow in advanced economies. That is, that the wealthier economies with greater resources, more service-oriented, are able to start flattening their CO2 emissions increases, while the rest of the world, namely OECD countries, it has continued to rise. However, the rate at which CO2 emission growth has been rising in developing countries has actually been going down. So in other words, they're just not growing as fast as they used to be. And we are hoping that we're getting towards some kind of a peak there as we look longer term. Next slide, please. Now, I think it's important when we talk about the overall sort of challenge related to climate and CO2 emissions that we recognize that there are multiple segments of the global economy that are responsible for total greenhouse gas emissions. In particular, we do think a lot about electricity and transport, which you see on the right-hand side. But industry and agriculture also account for a very large percentage of overall emissions, almost half globally. However, next slide, if you would. I am going to focus a good deal of my conversation today around electricity and transport. And the main reason for that is because that's where we have seen some of the most interesting progress. That's where we really are hopeful that you can see decarbonization based on the results that we've seen to date. Those other areas are frankly going to be harder. And we have seen less progress. They also, though, are a bit less volatile in terms of their CO2 emissions. They're fairly steady in terms of how much they produce. Next slide, please. So talking a little bit first about power. And this is really actually where Bloomberg NEF, we as a firm, began by focusing on renewable energy and truly zero carbon energy. We've seen over $4 trillion cumulatively invested in clean energy technologies around the world since 2004, which is when we were founded as a firm. You can see that those red bars at the bottom, that's the Asia Pacific region. And you can see that, back in the early days, it was much more of a story really of Europe and the US. But over time, China in a typical year accounts for about half of the total investment that we see into clean energy globally. With other countries in Southeast Asia and elsewhere also attracting substantial amounts of money. So each year now we're seeing, it's really been fairly consistent over the last 5 or so years, a bit over 300 billion, almost as high as 400 billion one year, but somewhere in that range year on year, and new capital flowing into projects, companies, et cetera, to build out this industry. Next slide, please. And what's been driving this is I like to think of the clean energy sort of evolution really in 2 phases. The first phase, probably ended about 5 or 6 years ago, and that was a phase in which basically subsidies and mandates really drove the growth of renewables. But really, in the last 5 years and even less in some technologies, cost competitiveness is what's been driving the growth. This is a very simple chart just showing you how expensive a typical multicrystalline photovoltaic module was. Those are just the standard module you put up on your roof. They were about $2 per watt back in 2010. I can even remember several years before that, they were somewhere around $7 or $8 a watt. But just since 2010, they've dropped from $2.10 a watt to 20 cents a watt. And the reason mainly for this is because of a massive scale up in production from China. And you guys, of course, know this probably way better than we do here on the East Coast, because California has been the biggest market for photovoltaics to date, as this has become more and more cost competitive. And really economies of scale have been the main reason for that. Next slide, please. We have seen a similar story for wind turbines, and it's a similar story in terms of a cost decline. As you can see, they've dropped by about 50% in the past decade, but for different reasons, actually. It's been less about economies of scale and China just flooding the market and driving down costs by scaling up, and more about the fact that there's been dramatic technological improvements in wind turbines that are getting bigger and bigger. The blades that are attached to them can scoop up more and more of the wind. They can be more efficient. And so when you look at the cost on a per megawatt basis, which is what this is based on, the costs have come down very dramatically. As a result of all this, if you go to the next slide, if you look at how much stuff, for lack of a better term, that the world has been building in terms of new power generating capacity. The number one technology for new build on a capacity basis has been solar. That's the yellow bar at the bottom. Wind, not that far behind it, about 500 total gigawatts that we've seen. With hydro, a lot of that built. Of course, it's worth noting that if you look at the top there, the coal bar is about 500 gigawatts that's been built in that same time period, with China accounting for a very large portion of that. And obviously, this is a huge part of the problem in terms of CO2 emissions. India is a big part of the rest of the world segment that you see there. And then as far as the bar of gas is concerned, a lot of that actually is in the US as well as other parts of the world. Next slide, please. And by the way, you may note there's a lot of text on these slides. Feel free to read these later. I think they're intended for reading purposes as well. I'm kind of talking through them, not necessarily touching on every point that you see written down on the page. But I thought that if I left the text in, then you could review it later and not have to take notes necessarily if interested. The other point, though, just as I was saying, is that we've seen cost competitiveness, and this is just a look at the countries around the world where we regard these technologies to be the lowest cost competitors. And I will, of course, put the giant caveat out there that, for instance, the United States is a big country, and onshore wind is not the lowest cost technology in every single corner of the country, but it is in a lot of parts of the country now. And the same is true in Canada. And as you can see, some of the Nordic countries, and Brazil in particular, has outstanding wind resources. So when you look at it on a levelized cost basis, you can see that these technologies now are the lowest cost. Solar as well, as you can see in China, in India, and in Australia. So importantly, these technologies are truly cost competitive without subsidy. Next slide, please. So, of course, the inevitable question and concern and complaint that is often raised about renewables is, well, what happens when the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining? How do you make sure that you can keep the lights on? And that's a fair question. The way in which our power system has been built is around the concept of baseload power. That's power that you can essentially flick on when you need it and flick off when you don't. And that's not the case of wind and solar. We are at the mercy of Mother Nature. But what can get you around that potentially are batteries, obviously. If you can store the energy that you need for 4 or maybe even 8 hours at a time, you can have it dispatch when consumers need it. And the good news here is that this is a similar chart to the one that I showed earlier for wind and solar, which is that battery costs have also dropped by about 90% since 2010. We do a survey of battery producers every year, and we've seen this very sharp decline. It is a similar story to solar in the sense that it's the massive scale up of manufacturing and economies of scale that's done this. But we're also seeing some new technologies come along. Next slide, please. One other kind of key driver that we've seen, which is worth noting, has been the leadership from corporations. Increasingly, and this is a larger conversation, but increasingly one of the interesting evolutions in the power market has been that customers, I would argue, have become more empowered as a result of a lot of technological changes. And what we're seeing more and more is demand from large corporates who want to buy renewable energy. And so last year, we saw a record of about 20 gigawatts of contracts signed. That's what a corporate PPA is. It's a power purchase agreement. And it set another record over 2018 and 2017. It's a broad base of companies that now are increasingly signing these kinds of contracts. Originally, it was technology companies that seemed to get it and be interested in it, but now we even occasionally see oil companies that are signing contracts to have their operations, in some cases, powered by renewables as well. So this is a corporate-led phenomenon, and it is global, although the United States is really the leader in this area. Next slide, please. And while talking about the US, I do think it's worth mentioning just how dramatic the change has been here over the last decade or so. If you look really not that long ago back to where we got our electricity from, back in 2005, it was about 50% of our power came from coal. Today, that's in 2019, it was less than a quarter of our power came from coal. Meanwhile, that top bar on the left that you can see, those blue bars, you can see renewable generation essentially has doubled over that period of time. You can see that nuclear power, interestingly, has stayed about the same over the period. And gas has really, really dramatically grown. It's also basically doubled over that period also. So a rapid shift away from coal towards gas and renewables. And the result has been much lower CO2 emissions. I'll talk about that in just a second. But one other thing I want to say about these charts before moving on is just that, the U.S. economy has been growing. We'll put aside this year, obviously, but it has been growing, albeit unspectacularly, had been over the prior 10 years. But if you look at how much actual electricity we consume, it really hasn't been growing almost at all. It's been pretty flat. And that's because in addition to this sort of decarbonization phenomenon that we're seeing, we're also seeing that people are making better use of the electricity that comes into their house through more efficient devices like Energy Star devices, through monitoring of their consumption, through digital thermostats. And then on the corporate side, they're even more active about wanting to be smart about their electricity consumption to save costs. So, we are actually not atypical from other wealthy economies in that we can grow our economy without adding electricity consumption in a major way. Next slide, please. Now, the result, though, of all this change over the last 10 years has that been from a CO2 emissions perspective, the U.S. has seen a transformation in that it was the power sector, which is that red line you see there, that was the clear major culprit when it came to CO2 emissions in the U.S. But thanks to really the last 5 years, power is no longer the number one source of CO2 emissions in the U.S. In fact, it's now the transportation sector, which is the green line, and you can see has not actually moved very much over the last number of years. So that really presents a new challenge, and I'm going to turn and talk about transportation in just a second. But you can see those other sectors also haven't really moved particularly much either, and they also are a challenge from a decarbonization perspective. Next slide, please. One last point, and then I'll stop talking about electricity specifically, but every year we at Bloomberg NEF do a long-term forecast looking out to 2050. We call it the New Energy Outlook, or NEO. And this is just our long-term view of where we think things are going overall. And it's actually a fairly simple methodology in the sense that we just take the technologies and the costs as we see them today, and as we've seen them declining so far, and we look forward and we say, okay, if these trends continue in ways that we think that they will, how will things continue to be transformed? We do this globally, but I did want to just show the US picture, and you can see that our view is that that black chunk at the bottom, which is not actually listed in the key, but that black bit at the bottom is coal. And you can see that coal has already been on the decline in terms of the number of terawatt hours that it contributes up to 2020. We think that that continues to go down. It does not get to zero, I would say, by 2050, but it does go down quite dramatically. The next layer in the cake up is the gray bit, which is natural gas. And again, I'm sorry that it's not on the legend here, but gas has been playing a greater role, and we think will continue to play a big role, and potentially a bit over half of generation by 2050 will come from the US natural gas. Nuclear, which is a zero carbon source of generation, is the red bit above, and we think that that will actually go down a bit as older nuclear plants retire. And then up on top, the top layers of the cake are solar and wind, which we do project to grow very dramatically over that time. One thing just before moving off this is to note that we make no assumptions about policies. So, for instance, former Vice President Biden yesterday announced his plan to want to get to a zero carbon electricity world by 2035. We don't make any assumptions about any policies that are not on the books at the moment. So this could look very different, frankly, with very different set of policies. But if you don't make major policy changes, we are looking at a world in which gas plays a continually growing role. Renewables do as well. Coal almost disappears, but not quite. Next slide, please. really quickly, and then because I am in the interest of time, want to move quick on these next couple slides. But one thing, looking on the global basis, we try and we paint similar pictures, or for different countries, like the one I just showed you for the U.S. And one thing I would note is that we are quite bullish about renewable energy, and yet if you look at the world that we forecast. And that's our NEO, New Energy Outlook 2019, that blue line. You can see that if you look over the next 10 years or so, and you want to try and get to a so-called 2-degree trajectory, that is to keep global warming in check at a 2-degree rate, we're sort of doing okay over the next 10 years. The problem is what happens thereafter, and that you really do need to reduce global power sector emissions much more than we would project will happen by pure economics, which again gets to the issue around the need for policy. Next slide, please. And on this next one, you can just dwell for just a very quick moment. On the next slide, basically, it just shows how much wider the gap is if you want to get it so that the global temperature only rises by 1.5 degrees on average. And there's a much wider gap there. And again, you've got a real challenge ahead. Okay, so I'm going to talk now for a few minutes about transportation, because if you go back to that pie that I showed, like I said, electricity was one segment where we've seen real progress on decarbonization and really substantial transformation. And then the next one is transportation. And I think we're really a really interesting and important part of point in the development of electric transportation. So first, just a tiny bit of context, which is this is up through the end of last year. Total car sales in the world actually peaked a couple of years ago. China's car sales, which has been what's driving the market, that bottom piece you can see actually declined a bit last year. Now you can only imagine what this year's chart's going to look like. It's probably going to have a very sharp divot, and then we'll see how it looks through the rest of the year. But in the grand scheme of things, total car sales actually appear to have peaked. So that's, I think, an important piece of context as we think about the climate challenge. Now, on the next slide, if you would, you can see that to date, we've now got about 7 million electric vehicles on the road worldwide. I think a lot of people don't know this, but that China, which is that bottom chunk in red that you see there, accounts for a bit under half, but a very substantial portion of all the electric vehicles that are on the roads today. The other thing that I think people don't recognize is that there's about 500,000 electric buses on roads around the world at the moment. Almost all of those, and that's that top chunk that you see for 2019, the gray bar or the gray block there. Most of that's in China also. So China is well ahead of the rest of the world on electrifying its fleet. Of course, we hear stories about Scandinavia and elsewhere where people are buying Teslas, and that's cool, and it's exciting. But in reality, when you're talking about sort of affordable cars and cars that are in compliance with regulation, cars that sort of the more average person can buy, China has really been a remarkable market for that, and also for public transportation. Next slide, please. I think the good news from a decarbonization perspective is that the automakers seem to recognize that electrification is the future. I would say that's sort of the altruistic view, is that they want to make a transformation to reduce emissions. The less altruistic view is that some of them have gotten busted for cheating on emissions, and some of this is paying penance for that and making a switch to try and decarbonize. Some of course, is also about just complying with corporate average fuel economy standards, which obviously you guys in California are familiar with, given the issues between CARB and the U.S. Federal Environmental Protection Agency. Next slide, please. Now, and I won't dwell too long on this, but I did want to make one important point. I showed earlier about how renewables have reached the point where they are cost competitive without subsidies in a lot of parts of the world. Electric vehicles at this very moment are at such an interesting and critical point in time where in a number of markets, they are still on a sticker price basis essentially a little more expensive than buying the equivalent car that is an internal combustion engine car. And so we haven't quite turned that corner where the consumer is going to walk into the showroom and buy an electric vehicle because It's the better car and the cheaper car without the benefit of any tax subsidies. Okay, so those yellow lines, without walking through each one of these, the yellow line that you see there is basically how much it would cost to buy, say, an average Toyota Corolla. And you can see the higher cost when you add up the blocks of buying an electric vehicle. And there are different components to what goes into that vehicle. There's the battery, which is in green. There's the powertrain of the vehicle. And then there's the rest of the car, which is in blue. And what you can see and why we're optimistic is that the green bars get smaller and smaller. And that goes back to the chart that I showed earlier about the cost of batteries. So once battery prices get just a little bit cheaper, consumers will be able to buy electric vehicles and they will not be relying on federal tax credits or other things to do it. They will do it because it makes economic sense. And then I'll throw one other sort of X factor into this, which is that, consumers, as you know, when it comes to buying cars, are not always entirely rational. And those of you who have driven an electric car, probably, and I have driven and have one, can speak to the fact that as a product, it's a very pleasurable car to drive. And you could argue that on sort of qualitative basis, there's going to be reasons that drive consumers towards electric vehicles that have nothing to do with the cost. Next slide, please. So, what does that mean in terms of transportation? It takes a long time to turn over to turn over a vehicle fleet globally. Tens of millions of cars on the road overall. So one of the things, though, that we do is we do a long-term forecast for electric vehicle adoption. And on the left-hand side is just looking at our projection for the percentage of sales that we think will come from either battery electric vehicles or plug-in hybrid electric vehicles up through 2040. And what you can see is that basically we do think there'll be a sharp increase in BEV and PHEV sales, but it still get to about 60% by about 2040. There'll be a lot of reasons why someone may still choose to buy an internal combustion engine car, including if they live in a rural area or other factors. And then if you look on the right-hand side, what that means, though, is that even by 2040, you would still only have about a third of the cars on the road that would be electric cars. The rest would still be internal combustion engines, which I think is just important to put in context as we think about the long-term demand for fuels. Next slide. And I won't dwell too much on this one other than to say that we have also looked at some of the other segments of the market besides cars. And there's been some major announcements. Amazon, for instance, has said that they plan to have 100,000 short-haul vans on the road in the not-too-distant future. And if you think about light-duty commercial vehicles who do a lot of stops and starts, maybe don't travel that many miles during the course of a day, there is a real economic argument for converting fleets to electric vehicles, and we think that there'll be a lot of that. We're less positive, if you look on the right-hand side, about heavy-duty commercial vehicles, mainly because of the amount of torque and the power that's required to move tons of freight over long distances. In fact, we think there's a real opportunity there for natural gas-powered vehicles instead, which will also be lower emission but not zero emission. Next slide, please. I won't dwell on this too long, other than to say that maybe more important than whatever it is that I'm telling you or what Bloomberg NEF has to say about electric vehicles is how perceptions are changing around EVs. Several years ago, we started putting out our forecast, which is those top bunch of lines that you see on the chart, BNEF 2016, and that projected how much electric vehicle adoption we expected in terms of millions of vehicles through 2040. And you can see we've revised it up, year after year. But more importantly than what we're doing is if you look at some of the forecasts that have come out from Exxon, from BP, from even OPEC, they themselves are changing what they think is going to be the demand for electric vehicles. And of course, that goes obviously into their thinking about what the demand will be for their product. Next slide, please. And along those lines, though, I did want to sort of, again, look at that very question about, so if the world does become more electric in terms of vehicles, what does that mean for demand for oil? On the left-hand side is where we were in 2019, and you can see about 42 million barrels per day of demand that was there from the transportation sector. from cars and from trucks and from 2- and 3-wheelers. If the fleet continues to expand over time, we think you could add another 25 million barrels per day of demand for oil products. That said, we also think that there will be fuel economy improvements that will reduce the demand. We think there'll be alternative drivetrains, and that's where I'm talking about electric vehicles. We also think that shared and autonomous vehicles will also reduce demand. So when you get to 2040, you're looking at demand from transportation, though, that is about 41 million barrels per day. If you think about that in terms of CO2 emissions, not so great. That basically we've done a round trip to sort of where we are today. And again, this is all based on the assumption that we don't have any new policies to expedite this transition to electric transportation. We just move at the speed that I've outlined that's based on economics. Next slide, please. Before moving quickly, I won't try and go into this next slide in too much detail, other than to mention that not all oil companies are created equal when it comes to their approaches around the energy evolution that's taking place. This is just a look at the number of deals that these 3 oil major companies have done in recent years to invest in solar, wind, biofuels, other areas as well. What's not on this chart are the U.S. oil majors, because frankly, they have not been as aggressive in terms of the actions that they have taken to try and invest in these areas. I think it's been, frankly, from a climate perspective, it's encouraging to hear some of the rhetoric that we hear from Shell and from BP about how they envision their opportunity to provide electricity to transportation and not just liquid fuels. We definitely hear less of that, I would say, from U.S. companies. So these are not all oil companies are the same, but I would also note that that there's still a long way frankly for all of them to go in terms of thinking about what their strategies is going to be. Their strategies are going to be around the transition. Next slide, please. And I'm just pretty conscious of time here, so I may zip a little bit through and maybe skip 1 or 2 here, but. As I mentioned earlier, and touched on very briefly, and that going all the way back to that pie chart that I showed, industrial heat and the industrial sector overall is a big part of the climate challenge. These industries that you see here, iron and steel, chemical, cement, aluminum, etc., they require a lot of heat to manufacture and produce. Heat that's not easily replaced by, frankly, any of the technologies that are zero carbon and readily available to us today. And so this does raise the question of, if you want to get at that segment of the economy, where and how will the transition come from? And the next slide, please. And one area that's been, frankly, talked about a lot has been hydrogen. I won't go into great detail here other than to say we did a very in-depth series of studies last year to look at this, because right now you can produce hydrogen for a variety of purposes, and it is used in various industrial processes. But it requires a lot of energy to be produced. It's not zero carbon. The question then is, can you take advantage of the fact that we now have very inexpensive power that comes from the sun and the wind? Can you take advantage of that to produce so-called green hydrogen? That's hydrogen that uses zero carbon power to be produced. And the short answer is yes, you can now, but it is not nearly as cheap as it is to produce using fossil fuels. And so the question is, what's the point at which you can drive those costs down so that you have viable green H2 that can be used? Our view is that you start to get there around 2030, but you will need a lot of investment. One of the findings from the left-hand chart that you see there is that we also found in our research is that there are so-called hydrolyzers that produce hydrogen that are operating and cheaper to build in China than they are in the West at the moment. And so that does give us hope that as you achieve more economies of scale, you can dramatically reduce costs. But to be clear, hydrogen is getting a lot of attention. People are writing a lot of stories. There's been some investment in it, but a lot needs to go into it for it to become truly economically viable. Next slide, please. I'm just going to touch on this for just a sec to say that the other aspect of all of this, which is taking a step away from the technologies and looking at the money for a second, is that we've seen a real trend towards so-called green bonds and green debts and all kinds of green financial products that take a variety of forms and have been growing in popularity. And again, I'll just keep moving just in the interest of time. Next slide, please. And the other trend that we've seen is towards greater disclosure from companies. The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which is a mouthful, is a coalition that has been encouraging companies to report in greater detail about their carbon footprints and their other forms of ESG activities. The number of companies that participate in this has grown rather spectacularly since 2017. And what this has meant is that there's greater reporting about what companies are actually doing. This is something that sort of Mama Bloomberg, we're Bloomberg NEF, a division of Bloomberg, but Bloomberg LP, and Mike Bloomberg himself personally has been very involved in trying to encourage companies to disclose this information about their footprints, but also about the kind of risks that they face in a changing climate going forward. Next slide, please. Let's actually skip the next slide because it's just too much to take on, but maybe the slide after that. I feel like you can't talk now about energy, and I realize that very much that CalSTRS, you guys very much have a long-term view on things, and basically so much of what I've talked about looks out to 2030 and 2050 even. But I'd be remiss if I didn't say at least one or two things about the current crisis that we're in, because it is obviously so all-consuming. And just two quick thoughts from an energy perspective. The first is that in terms of demand for liquid fuels, not surprisingly, getting everybody to stay at home has put a major dent in how much demand that there has been. The left-hand chart simply shows implied gasoline demand actually up through just last week. The green line at the bottom there is 2020, and you can see just how dramatically out of line it's been by really a halving of demand during some months overall for road fuels. The right-hand chart, I won't go through all of them, but just looks at levels of congestion and how traffic is, frankly, here in Washington, I'm sure there as well and other places, hadn't been an issue for a while. So it's really been the sellers of liquid fuels that have taken it on the chin as we've gone into this crisis. Next and final slide, please. And sorry that this slide is a little complicated, but would just say that the main takeaway here is that, not too shockingly, electricity demand has not really been all that different than what we would have expected. So the black line here on this chart shows you the actual load or demand for electricity that we've seen. And then the blue line, just above it, shows what we would have projected electricity demand to have been week to week, with a confidence interval around it, given that there is a margin for error there. There are a lot of factors that go into our demand for electricity on a day-to-day basis. As you guys must know, in Sacramento, on days when the thermometer crosses 100, demand is much higher than it is when it's down at 80. Same here in Alexandria, where it's about 90 degrees today. So that affects it. And so you really have to look at what would have been demand under some kind of normal circumstance. And some people have shown charts in which they show this dramatic decline in electricity demand versus last year. Well, that's not really the point. The point is, where would it be versus where it should have been in a normal year? And frankly, it's not that different. And the main reason is because, as you might imagine, while a number of companies are using a lot less electricity, we're all using a lot more at home. I don't know what your utility bill looks like, but we've been setting records here. And so I think that there is an offset there. So it's the utility sector as a business, in some ways, you could argue, has never looked stronger, even with all this transformation. But I do think that the COVID-19 phenomenon has certainly called into question, well, let's just put it this way, it's certainly challenging the business model of fossil fuels. Anyway, my last slide is just simply a reiteration of the main messages that I was trying to make before. I will just close by saying that that first, of course, thanks for giving me this opportunity. But second, that we are very much of the view that you will continue to see major change going forward. We've tried to start to map some of the COVID-19 impacts. It, of course, has made it even more uncertain on a go-forward basis. But we still think that the fundamentals around decarbonization is going to continue, and that's not something that we're going to see changing, mainly because of economics. The really open question is what kind of policy drivers might come along and change the game so that we can actually get towards the goal of decarbonization even faster. So with that, let me hand it back to Chris or to Joy, and I'm happy to take questions.
Great. Wow, Ethan, thank you very much. That was a tremendous amount of information in a short period of time, and I think probably several board members and along with me feel like we could spend a couple of hours chewing through all this information with you. Just a lot to digest, but I know we'll have some questions. So the first question we have up is from the controller, Betty Yee. Betty?
Thank you, Joy, and thank you, Ethan, for the presentation. It is a lot of information, but where you ended the presentation was really what I was interested in, and that is, what are those policy drivers going to be? And I know there are efforts underway on a number of fronts, but aside from maybe looking at stripping the oil industry of subsidies and setting a price on carbon, are there others that are really promising that could be helpful there?
Yes, well, good question. There's a lot of different things, the price on carbon, and I'm here in Washington, so the question is how live a conversation that is. I would say, maybe, again, just a qualitative judgment, maybe not that live, given that it wasn't on Joe Biden's kind of wish list of things that he announced yesterday. But I do think that there are other things you can do. We've seen ideas around some form of a national clean energy standard that would mandate some kind of decarbonization across the country. There are certainly in the transportation side, the corporate average fuel economy standards, as originally promulgated or last promulgated by the Obama administration, were quite aggressive. They've now been watered down. Those could be reinstated back to where they were. That would certainly help push things along and ensure that the auto industry continue to improve its efficiency. Standards around appliances have made a big difference. It's kind of a sort of a less heralded area that we see focus on. But some of those kind of nitty-gritty in the weeds policies can make a really big difference. And while I certainly sympathize with those who are purists and think that a carbon price is the most efficient way to decarbonize, and I hear that. I also feel like here in the real world, the political reality is it can be very challenging to get that done. And if you can accomplish many of the same things through a lot of small rules, then that's probably the way to go.
Right. So, one of the things I was happy you stressed, and that is, and obviously with the divestment discussions really elevating in volume, the idea about, how do you really control ongoing demand? And, you laid out in terms of some of the progress that some of the European companies are making, U.S. companies a little bit slower. But let's say if we were to divest from those, like where does that market share go? Because we're not even talking about even some of the nationally owned companies. What, like the companies in China, Saudi Arabia, others? Do they play, how big of a role do they play in terms of where we need to go?
It's a good question. Of course, the giant caveat first is sort of, to some degree also, is what happens with COVID-19. There's some very important short-term factors that have to do with, that are going to affect oil demand and oil prices, and in turn the fate of the sort of so-called swing producers, which are the U.S. shale oil producers. And I think all of that is really important to keep an eye on, to see what happens there in the short run, because that will determine to some degree what the longer term price of oil might be around the world. So I think that's something to keep in mind. As I said, on our view, unless there's major policy change, the world is still going to demand a lot of fossil fuels going forward. And so then the question is, who is going to supply them? Where are they going to come from? Interestingly enough, the U.S. as a market essentially had reached the point where we were no longer a net importer of oil as of last year, which is kind of an amazing accomplishment in its own right. And I don't know where we'll end up, once this crazy year is over. But nonetheless, there was an enormous amount of production that's come online in the United States. And so then the question is, if you don't want to get it from the U.S., where do you get it? The U.S. is not the lowest cost producer in many cases. So if you do shut in wells here, then you are potentially going to have to buy oil from elsewhere, where it will potentially be cheaper, yes, but it will also potentially need to be transported here.
Yeah. And then my last question is, how do you factor in, I guess, the concept of stranded assets into your forecast?
So, I mean, we let's put it this way: assets will get stranded. We assume assets start to get stranded at the pace at which economics drives that stranding, for lack of a better way to describe it. So, it will happen in some markets where the price of renewables will undercut existing fossil generation. And we try and look at it really in two ways. So first is what we call tipping point 1, which is the point at which renewable power is cheaper than fossil power when you go to add that next incremental megawatt of capacity. And that tipping point 1, we think we've already achieved in a number of markets. The harder tipping point is the so-called tipping point 2, and that's the moment at which you basically say, oh boy, we've got a solar plant, and it's so much cheaper than the existing coal plant that we're going to take that coal plant offline. And we are not there in a number of countries yet. And we need to get there, in particular countries like India and China, in order to start stranding those assets. But we don't think that happens there. I'll have to check our exact year, but probably about 10 years out before you start to get to that second tipping point in countries like that. So that's the point where assets will start to get stranded.
Okay, great. Thank you, Joy. Thank you, Ethan. This, I think, at least for me, kind of broadens kind of our orientation around how we look at this industry going forward. Really appreciate your being here.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Betty. We have a couple more speakers. First, we'll go to Bill and then to Jennifer. Bill?
Thank you, Ethan, and thank you, Joy. Ethan, I'm curious about the impact of transportation, and you covered surface transportation, but not air transportation. What is the role? How large is that a component of the impact? I mean,
good
around, and as the emerging nations become more emergent, they're going to be traveling more. Assuming no pandemic, a lasting pandemic. What is the impact of air travel?
That's a really good question, and I wish I knew the exact percentage off the top of my head, but transportation is about 14% overall of greenhouse gas emissions. I'm going to guesstimate it's about 2% that's from air travel, 2% versus the full 100. So it's an important part, and it's and frankly, it's a place where you can make real improvements. I don't know about you, but at our company, they will tell you the exact CO2 emissions for your flight. And if you look at the amount of CO2 that your household, your own footprint is, your flights are represent a huge percentage of the total. So it's an area where we definitely can make improvements. And I do think that it raises a real concern going forward as countries do start to do more air travel. That said, I do think COVID is really could be really one of those interesting changes. Because I don't know about you, but I think for our business, we certainly we've been amazed at how much we can get done without traveling. And B, I think we're going to think about whether we needed to travel as much as we did, before all this struck. And I imagine a lot of business is going to have that consideration as well. And given that business travel does account for a very large portion of the overall amount of travel, I think it's something to keep an eye on. So anyway, I don't mean to play that down in any way. I think it is an important concern. But if I think about developing countries, the thing that keeps me up more at night is how many more people are going to buy, buying cars. While the total number of car sales isn't going up, you're still selling whatever number of millions of them each year in India and China.
But there is an alternative. There's no electric plane yet. So, at some point, if the costs come down, there's no barrier to purchasing the electric car.
That's right. And we're seeing it in developing countries, actually, the other alternative that we're seeing a lot more are electric 2- and 3-wheel transportation, which has been growing very quickly.
Thank you, Ethan.
Sure.
Thank you, Bill. Okay, Jennifer.
Thank you. Thank you, Ethan, for your presentation. One question I have is related to some news articles that came out this week about the soaring methane emissions and how they were saying that it's putting the climate goals at risk. In your opinion, what does that mean for investments in green or technology, clean or green technology?
Good question. And I wish I'd seen the article. Do you recall if it was regarding methane emissions from oil and gas production or from cattle or from something?
Cattle. From cattle.
Look, it is a major issue. I mean, we as a firm have frankly just started to look at agriculture in a serious way. Our heritage is around electricity originally, and then transportation. And I would say that it's very interesting. Obviously, as least developed countries develop more, there creates greater demand for meat, and we've seen that in non-OECD countries. However, in developed countries, it's interesting to see the greater popularity of these meat alternatives that has been growing pretty quickly. And of course, if we have a major economic downturn, that also cuts into people's ability to buy red meat. I think we're already seeing some of that as well. So I think those are some mitigating factors, but nonetheless, methane as an issue is a major one. There has been some efforts around so-called renewable natural gas, which uses methane generated from biodigesters from pig waste and other things like that. And that is a really interesting area that's seen more investment from, in some cases, conventional natural gas companies, because they want to find a zero carbon gas that can be used in homes and businesses as an alternative. I think there's a sort of larger bit of politics going on there, which is, and I think you've seen some of this in California, which is natural gas has been very much part of to date, has been very much generally part of a positive story of decarbonizing the power sector. But I think increasingly people are looking longer term and saying, can we be as reliant on gas and truly drive CO2 out of the system? And of course, there's thousands and thousands of miles of gas distribution lines and gas that comes into our houses and being used in my stove and everything today. And is there a lower carbon alternative? And of course, again, RNG, as it's called, is being increasingly looked at, although it's a very small percentage of the overall market right now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Chris, you had some comments?
Just one quick question, and I know we're long on time. Ethan, so if I have it right, energy, electricity generation is the number one user, then transportation. But I believe your chart also showed agriculture and then obviously industry. You mentioned within industry that hydrogen was a potential. But when's that time frame? Is that 2030, 2040, 2050? And then the same question on agriculture. When can we move away from fossil fuels there?
Good questions. For industry and hydrogen, generally we're thinking sometime in the 2030s. I think it's what's real at earliest. But again, this is an area where it's, the other technologies, I kind of show you some nice charts in the so-called learning curve, and we've seen that economies of scale drive this, that, and the other. hydrogen, this is it's a real open question about how quickly you could drive costs down. And so, if we see a major investment from governments and others to try and scale this up, we could accelerate it potentially. We've done our best estimates based on what we've seen worldwide on that. Agriculture is a similar story, but it's interesting. These industry and ag, and maybe even ag more than industry, are just hard to shift. There's just not they're not as easily. There isn't just an option that you can swap in one thing for another and make a quick change on it. So again, and I'll confess that on ag, it's something we've not dug in as much on. We're doing a lot more research on right now. But again, preliminarily, it's a long-term change. It's a 2030, 2040 kind of thing.
Great, thank you. So we don't have any other board members in the queue. Ethan, there was a ton of great information that we heard. I think just one of the things that resonated with me was one of your opening remarks, which is that assuming the status quo is the riskiest bet of all. And a lot of the data that you presented just sort of showed how quickly the technology is evolving, policy is evolving, decision-making is evolving. I think you're aware of some of the things that we've been doing and are doing, with our committee and looking at a transition to a low-carbon economy. So it just, really reinforces, I think, a lot of the great work that our staff has been doing. And so we appreciate your being able to share some insight with us. We do have two speakers who wanted to just offer a comment on this item. Just as a reminder, we have I think we're going to post the time frame for the speakers for this public comment, and we have a total of 10 minutes for public comment on this item. I will turn it over to, I think, Danielle to manage the public comment.
Our first caller is Park. Park, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much, Ethan, for your presentation. That was really informative. And thank you, Ms. Yee, for your questions about divestment. I just wanted to see if you could comment on a report that was put out on July 9th by the Center for International Environmental Law, and it's titled Debt-Driven Dividends and Asset Fire Sales, Latest Signs of Oil and Gas Industry Decline. And there are just two quotes from that I wanted to share. Fiduciaries have a duty to reevaluate the soundness of continued investments in a sector in long-term decline, and policymakers have a duty not to pour public funds into companies that are both economically unstable and environmentally destructive. The longer pension funds stay invested in fossil fuels, despite stark warning signs about financial precarity and climate exposure, the more fiduciary risks accrue. So I was just hoping you could comment on the kind of fiduciary risk that exists for choosing a strategy of engagement with the fossil fuel industry. Thank you so much.
Danielle, it's Joy. I think I want to interject here. Park, we appreciate your comments. I think I know that there are some rules that we have as a board around how we manage public comment. And before we move forward, I guess I just wondered if I think Brian Bartow, our general counsel, is on, or Roslyn, if you could just advise, to make sure that we're handling the situation correctly or appropriately in terms of a question from a member of the public.
Hi, Joy, this is Brian.
Great, thanks.
Hi, I appreciate the question. I did hear the comment. I think one of the things to keep in mind is, although I think the gentleman's name was Park, I think though he asked a question and a response, it's not on your agenda. The give and take and the issue is not on your agenda. So really the role of the board at this point, or the committee at this point, is to take and receive the comment and then determine later if it results in additional information or another item that the committee wants to bring forward in another meeting.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Brian. I'm glad you were on. I wanted to make sure that we handled that appropriately, so thank you.
You're welcome.
So Danielle, I think we'll go to the second speaker.
Our last caller is Vanessa. Vanessa, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great, thank you. I very much appreciated Mr. Zendler's presentation, and I just had a few comments about some of the slides. So one of your early slides showed U.S. generation, power generation and predictions, but those are only for the United States. I'm curious about why it was only the United States that was included. The international numbers are quite different, and I would encourage the board to ask him for international power generation numbers and predictions as well. I also take issue with the oil majors' diverse approaches to clean energy slide, because what that is a super zoomed in look at their total expenses. There's a recent study that shows it's the 5-year plan, as a study by Rystad Energy in Norway, shows that the 5-year plan for oil majors is investing $166 billion in oil and gas projects versus $17 billion in renewables. So those comparisons about which, it's sort of like comparing who's the bigger midget when it comes to renewable investment. And I would even add that the majority of that 17 billion is all just from one Norwegian company. So on average, it's about 1.5%, I believe, of capital expenditures from the oil and gas majors is actually being invested in renewables. So I think that slide's a little bit misleading. And lastly, the EV information, it would be great also if you could provide the board, Mr. Zendler, with information on the cost of ownership, because as you mentioned, the upfront cost is almost at parity with ICE cars, but it is substantially lower when it comes to ownership, maintenance, and fueling. And that is, as the cars get older and people start to buy older vehicles, that is going to also change the financial calculus for electrification of transportation. Lastly, I just want to point out that STRS is such a large entity. You have so much money and you are such a big player in the international markets that your fiduciary duty to protect the investments of your members at this point, given the climate cliff that we are heading towards, requires you to exert your power in driving these markets rather than following them. So when you see this data, I really hope that you think, how can we help bend that curve? How can we help flatten that curve? Because quite frankly, the picture of that U.S. generation prediction, assuming no policy changes, is a picture of apocalypse. That is a picture that ensures that your members who are set to retire in 2040 or 2050 won't be able to because the world will be on fire. Thank you for your time. I appreciate you covering this issue.
Thank you for your comment. That concludes the public comments.
Great, thanks very much, Samantha, and thank you to our public commenters. I think as we always do, any comments that are provided to the board, either verbally at the meeting or in writing, our staff takes a look at and considers those issues and reports back to the board. So we'll do so with some of the comments and questions that were posed here as well. I think we don't have any other questions for you. Ethan, thank you very much. Thank you for spending as much time with us as you did today. Like I said, lots of information, I think, for us to continue to consider, and I hope that we'll be able to continue to call on you if we have other questions or need more information. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I before I go, can I just offer to be available to answer those questions to the people who are asking them to me? If now's not the appropriate time, I'm happy to take it offline, and if you have their contact information, I'm happy to follow up with them.
I think what we can do is we do have their information provided to us, and so what we can do is offline, Ethan, follow up, have a member of our staff follow up with you and figure out how to provide information back to them or provide it to the whole committee if that's appropriate. So we'll follow up with you and do that.
I would certainly welcome the chance to answer, so that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So that takes us to item 15, which is just a review of information requests. Rosalind, can you cover off? I think we had a couple during the course of the day.
Sure. So with respect to item number 11, Mr. Keeley has asked Makita to follow up offline on some of the costs related to the SISS portfolio. And then I have this last one that you just discussed, having the staff follow up regarding the public comment and responses by Ethan to the public comment questions.
Okay. I think I had written down also, there may have been a couple of other, and I think Gail is not on, so Jennifer, we may need to follow up with you and Gail, but I think that there may be a couple of questions that Gail also had regarding, sorry, I'm trying to make sense of my notes here. I don't know if it was related to the investment business plans or the SISS investment policy, but I thought there might have been one or two follow-up items that she had as well.
11B.
It was either on 10 or 11A.
Okay.
We can, maybe what we can do is we can follow up offline. Okay,
yeah.
We'll follow up offline. Okay, thank you. Okay, item 16 is the draft agenda for our next committee meeting. Chris, anything that you'd like to highlight for the draft agenda? Oh, I'm sorry, hang on I'm sorry, Chris, hold on 1 second. I didn't realize I had a couple of board members in the queue. So Harry and then Betty, and this may be going back to the review of information requests. So
it
Harry?
is, Madam. Yes, thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Rosalind, for capturing that, but no need for the staff to follow up directly with the full board. I just meant to, I'll contact Mika and ask her my specific questions. It wasn't meant for an information item for the full committee.
Okay.
So thank you for capturing it though. Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks, Joy. Thanks, Joy.
Okay. Thank you, Harry. Okay, and Betty, I'm wondering if what I thought was Gail was actually a request from you. So
yeah, it may be, and it was just really to add to the discussion when the SISS item comes back in September. Just a deeper dive about the relationship of the, the integration work of the other portfolio managers as compared to what SISS is doing, just so there's not kind of this creep to put it all on the SISS team.
Okay.
Okay.
Great, thank you. Okay, so Chris, the draft agenda for the next meeting?
Yeah, thank you, Joy. The bulk of that meeting, September and March, are always big books for you because that is our semi-annual performance review. This is going to be the June 30 numbers, so it will be a very detailed book. Electronically, it's just as light as anything else. We'll spend most of that meeting going through the semi-annual performance. I do have a block of time on there for Brian and Travis to talk about the BNEF slides. So what I think I'll do is work with you, Joy, to see if we want to expand that to include the human capital management and give SISS an opportunity to maybe run through some of their engagement success questioned, and then as well as review some of the BNEF slides that were requested. The other thing I would highlight is it looks like we're putting our final numbers together. It looks like we're going to be 3.9% net, 3.88. A 3-year number is going to be 6.5. So less than 7. And I'll break the news. Probably the 2 board members on the CalPERS board might know, but CalPERS announced their 4.7. So they got us this year. We still have them over 10 and I think 20, which counts. But as I said, I actually do expect most of the peers to become, I have seen 2.5 and I've seen 3. So, but I think we'll see wide dispersion in the returns among peers. So we did beat our benchmarks, at least initially. That's the indication, which is a good thing. And on 3 years also beat the benchmarks, which is critical for us. So we'll put the press release together. I don't know if that's going out this week or next, but we'll get the final numbers. That will all be presented in your board book in September. And we'll have Makita, our CLCO, go into details throughout that performance. And so that really will be that meeting and the key discussion. And we'll continue information and updates on the low carbon transition.
Great, thank you, Chris. Anyone have any questions for Chris about the draft agenda? Okay, I don't think we have any other members of the public to speak at this point. So I think that concludes our open session for today. I think logistically, everybody is supposed to exit this meeting because we have a different Zoom meeting conference space to enter for closed session. So it's 1:47 now. You know, we can reconvene there in 5 minutes, or you know, we are running a little bit over at this point, or we can start up at 2 o'clock if people need a few minutes to stretch in between. I'm seeing yeses. Okay, so please try to log in to the closed session a few minutes early so that we can try to start on time right at 2 o'clock. Okay, I'll see people in closed session at 2. Thank you.